Hello, 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 greetings, salutations, konnichiwa, and every other form of greeting across this vast, marvelous multiverse. I am Matsu Quinox. This is Horace, and welcome, my dear scholars, to the study. It's wonderful to have you all here. Hello there, Julian20, welcome. Hello there, Dr. Zadium, welcome, and hello there, Private Maverick, welcome. Yes, it's all good to see. It's very good to see you all. Yes, as you can probably tell, we are still somewhat snowed in, but we're not letting that get us down. I hope you're all doing well. You're all doing all right, and if you're not, I hope this stream will help you to feel a little bit better. Hello there, Firefly. Welcome. It's good to see you. It's good to see you all. It means so much to see my wonderful scholars here tonight. Um, so yes, tonight we will be finishing off The Wind in the Willows. We only have a few chapters left, and I thought it might be nice to do an extra long stream. Um, so I hope you're all eager to enjoy it as much as I am. I mean, it's been quite fun, hasn't it? So yes, last time we left off, Toad had finally managed to escape from prison, though where he plans to go, I don't know. Well, no, I know where he plans to go. He plans to go back to Toad Hall, where his home was. And he went through quite a few misadventures to get there. So it seems, well, it of course seems like you would think the next chapter would be all about Toad and what had happened next. But honestly, it is not. The next chapter is of a different subject. So, my dear scholars, shall we begin the stories tonight? Julian20, yes, please. Oh, you seem eager to do so. Hmm. Well, I suppose there's no time like the present, or the past, or the future, or whatever time it is now. So, let us begin. Chapter 9 Wayfarers All. The water rat was restless, and he did not exactly know why. To all appearances, the summer's pomp was still at fullest height, and although in the tilled acres green had given way to gold, though rowans were reddening and the woods were dashed here and there with tawny fierceness, yet light and warmth and color were still present in undiminished measure, clean of any chilly premonitions of the passing year. But the constant chorus of the orchids and hedges had shrunk to a casual evensong from a few yet unwearied performers. The robin was beginning to assert himself once more, and there was a feeling in the air of change and departure. The cuckoo, of course, had long been silent, but many another feathered friend, for months a part of the familiar landscape and its small society, was missing too, and it seemed that the ranks thinned steadily day by day. Rat, ever observant of all winged movement, saw that it was taking daily a southerning tendency, and even as he lay in bed at night, he thought he could make out, passing in the darkness overhead, the beat and quiver of impatient pinions, obedient to the perem- sorry, pardon me, peremptory call. Nature's grand hotel has its season, like the others. As the guests one by one pack, pay, and depart, and the seats at the table d'hote shrink pitifully at each succeeding meal, as suites of rooms are closed, carpets taken up, and waiters sent away, those boarders who are staying on en pension until the next year's full reopening cannot help being somewhat affected by all these flitterings and farewells This eager discussion of plans, routes, and fresh quarters, this daily shrinkage in the stream of comradeship. One gets unsettled, depressed, and inclined to be querulous. Why this craving for change? Why not stay on quietly here like us and be jolly? You don't know this hotel out of the season, and what fun we have amongst ourselves, we fellows who remain and see the whole interesting year out. All very true. No doubt the others always reply, we quite envy you, and some other year perhaps. But just now we have engagements, and there's the bus at the door. Our time is up. So they depart with a smile and a nod, and we miss them, and feel resentful. The rat was a self-sufficing sort of animal, rooted to the land, and whoever went, he stayed. Still, he could not help noticing what was in the air, and feeling some of its influence in his bones. It was difficult to settle down to anything seriously with all this flitting going on. Leaving the waterside, where rushes stood thick and tall in a stream that was becoming sluggish and low, he wandered countrywards, crossed a field or two of pasture, already looking dusty and parched, and thrust into the great sea of wheat, yellow, wavy, and murmurous, full of quiet motion and small whisperings. Here he often loved to wander, through the forest of stiff strawn stalks that carried their own golden sky away over his head, a sky that was always dancing, shimmering, softly talking, or swaying strongly to the passing wind, and recovering itself with a toss and a merry laugh. Here too he had many small friends, a society, complete in itself, leading full and busy lives, but always with a spare moment to gossip and exchange news with a visitor. Oh, I forgot to part the curtains. My mistake. Today, however, though they were civil enough, the field mice and harvest mice seemed preoccupied. Many were digging and tunneling busily. Others, gathered together in small groups, examined plans and drawings of small flats, stated to be desirable and compact, and situated conveniently near the stores. Some were hauling out dusty trunks and dress baskets. Others were already elbow deep packing their belongings, while everything piles and bundles of wheat, oats, barley, beech mast, and nuts lay about ready for transport.
"Here's old Ratty!"
they cried as soon as they saw him.
"Come and bear a hand, Rat, and don't stand about idle."
What sort of game are you up to?" said the water rat severely. "You know it isn't the time to be thinking of winter quarters yet, by a long way."
"Oh, yes, we know that,"
exclaimed a field mice rather shamefacedly.
"but it's always as well to be in good time, isn't it? We really must get all the furniture and baggage and stores moved out of this before those horrid machines begin clicking round the fields, and then, you know, the best flats get picked up so quickly nowadays, and if you're late you have to put up with anything, and they want such a lot of doing up too, before they're fit to move into. Of course we're early. We know that, but we're only just making a start."
"Oh, bother starts," said the rat. "It's a splendid day. Come for a row, or a stroll on the hedges, or a picnic in the woods, or something."
"Well, I think not today, thank you,"
replied the field mouse hurriedly.
"Perhaps some other day, when we've more time."
The rat, with a snort of contempt, swung round to go, tripped over a hat box, and fell, with undignified remarks.
"If people would be more careful,"
said a field mouse rather stiffly,
"and look where they're going, people wouldn't hurt themselves and forget themselves. Mind that hold all, Rat. You'd better sit down somewhere. In an hour or two we may be more free to attend to you."
"You won't be free, as you call it, You won't be free, as you call it, much this side of Christmas, I can see that," retorted the rat grumpily, as he picked his way out of the field. He returned somewhat despondently to his river again, his faithful, steady-going old river, which never packed up, flitted, or went into winter quarters. In the oysters which fringed the bank he spied a swallow sitting. Presently it was joined by another, and then by a third, and the birds, fidgeting restlessly on their bough, talked together earnestly and low. "What, already?" said the rat, strolling up to them. "What's the hurry? I call it simply ridiculous."
"Oh, we're not off yet, if that's what you mean," replied the first swallow. "We're only making plans and arranging things, talking it over, you know. What route we're taking this year, and where we'll stop, and so on. That's half the fun."
"Fun?" said the rat. "Now that's just what I don't understand. If you've got to leave this pleasant place, and your friends who will miss you, and your snug homes that you've just settled into, why, when the hour strikes, I've no doubt you'll go bravely, and face all the trouble and discomfort and change and newness, and make believe that you're not very unhappy. But to want and to talk about it, or even think about it, till you really need—"
"No, you don't understand, naturally,"
said the second swallow.
"First we feel it stirring within us, a sweet unrest. Then back come the recollections, one by one, like homing pigeons. They flutter through our dreams at night. They fly with us in our wheelings and circlings by day. We hunger to inquire of each other, to compare notes, and assure ourselves that it was all really true, as one by one the scenes, the scents and sounds and names of long-forgotten places come gradually back and beckon to us."
"Couldn't you stop on for just this year?" suggested the water rat wistfully. "We'll all do our best to make you feel at home. You've no idea what good times we have here, while you are far away."
"I tried stopping on one year," said the third swallow. "I had grown so fond of the place that when the time came I hung back and let the others go on without me. For a few weeks it was all well enough, but afterwards, oh, the weary lengths of the nights, the shivering sunless days, the air so clammy and chill, and not an insect in the acre of it. No, it was no good. My courage broke down, and one cold stormy night I took wing, flying well inland, on account of the strong easterly gales. It was snowing hard as I beat through the passes of the great mountains, and I had a stiff fight to win through. But never shall I forget the blissful feeling of the hot sun again on my back, as I sped down to the lakes that lay so blue and placid below me, and the taste of my first fat insect. The past was like a bad dream. The future was all happy holiday, as I moved southwards week by week, easily, lazily, lingering as long as I dared, but always heeding the call. No, I had had my warning. Never again did I think of disobedience."
Excuse me.
"Ah, yes, the call of the South," twittered the other two dreamily. "Its songs, its hues, its radiant air. Oh, do you remember?"
And forgetting the rat, they slid into passionate reminiscence, while he listened fascinated, and his heart burned within him. In himself, too, he knew that it was vibrating at last, that chord hitherto dormant and unsuspected. The mere chatter of these southern-bound birds, their pale and second-hand reports, had yet power to awaken this wild new sensation, and thrill him through and through with it. What would one moment of the real thing work in him? One passionate touch of the real southern sun, one waft of the authentic odor. With closed eyes he dared to dream a moment in full abandonment, and when he looked again, the river seemed steely and chill, the green fields gray and lightless. Then his loyal heart seemed to cry out on his weaker self for its treachery.
"Why do you ever come back then at all?" he demanded of the swallows jealously. "What do you find to attract you in this poor damned little country?" "And do you think," said the first swallow, "that the other call is not for us too, in its due season? The call of lush meadow grass, wet orchids, warm insect-haunted ponds, of browsing cattle, of haymaking, and all the farm buildings clustered round the house of the perfect eaves?" "Do you suppose," asked the second one, that you are the only living thing that craves with a hungry longing to hear the cuckoo's note again? In due time, said the third, we shall be homesick once more for quiet water lilies swaying on the surface of an English stream. But today, all that seems pale and thin and very far away. Just now our blood dances to other music.
They fell a twittering amongst themselves once more, and this time their intoxicating babble was of violet seas, tawny sands, and lizard-haunted walls. Restlessly, the rat wandered off once more, climbed the slope that rose gently from the north bank of the river, and lay, looking out towards the great ring of downs that barred his vision further southwards, his simple horizon hitherto, his mountains of the moon, his limit behind which lay nothing he had cared to see or to know. Today, to him gazing south with a new-born need stirring in his heart, the clear sky over their long, low outlines seemed to pulsate with promise. Today the unseen was everything, the unknown the only real fact of life. On this side of the hills was now the real blank, on the other lay the crowded and colored panorama that his inner eye was seeing so clearly. What seas lay beyond, green leaping and crested! What sun-bathed coasts, along which the white villas glittered against the olive woods! What quiet harbors, thronged with gallant shipping bound for purple islands of wine and spice, islands set low in languorous waters! He rose and descended riverwards once more, then changed his mind, and sought the side of the dusty lane. There, lying half buried in the thick, cool underhedge tangle that bordered it, he could muse on the metalled road and all the wondrous world that it led to, on all the wayfarers, too, that might have trodden it, and the fortunes and adventures they had gone to seek or found unseeking, out there, beyond, beyond. Footsteps fell on his ear, and the figure of one that walked somewhat wearily came into view, and he saw that it was a rat, and a very dusty one. The wayfarer, as he reached him, saluted with a gesture of courtesy that had something foreign about it, hesitated a moment, then with a pleasant smile turned from the track, and sat down by his side in the cool herbage. He seemed tired, and the rat let him rest unquestioned, understanding something of what was in his thoughts, knowing too the value all animals attach at times to mere silent companionship, when the weary muscles slacken and the mind marks time. The wayfarer was lean and keen-featured, and somewhat bowed at the shoulders. His paws were thin and long, his eyes much wrinkled at the corners, and he wore small gold earrings in his neatly set, well-shaped ears. His knitted jersey was of a faded blue. His breeches, patched and stained, were based on a blue foundation, and his small belongings that he carried were tied up in a blue cotton handkerchief. When he had rested a while, the stranger sighed, snuffed the air, and looked about him. "That was clover, that warm whiff on the breeze," he remarked, "and those are cows we hear cropping the grass behind us and blowing softly between mouthfuls. There is a sound of distant reapers, and yonder rises a blue line of cottage smoke against the woodland. The river runs somewhere close by, for I hear the call of the moorhen, and I see by your build that you're a fresh-water mariner. Everything seems asleep, and yet going on all the time. It's a goodly life that you lead, friend, no doubt the best in the world, if only you are strong enough to lead it." "Yes, it is the life, the only life to live," responded the water rat dreamily, without his usual wholehearted conviction. "I did not say exactly that," replied the stranger cautiously,
but no doubt it's the best. I've tried it, and I know. And because I've just tried it, 6 months of it, and know it's the best, here am I, footsore and hungry, tramping away from it, tramping southward, following the old call, back to the old life, the life which is mine, and which will not let me go. Is this then yet another of them? Mused the rat. And where have you just come from? He asked. He hardly dared to ask where he was bound for. He seemed to know the answer only too well. Nice little farm, nice little farm, replied the wayfarer briefly. Up a lawn in that direction. He nodded northwards. Never mind about it. I had everything I could want, everything I had any right to expect of life, and more. And here I am. Glad to be here all the same, though. Glad to be here. So many miles further on the road. So many hours nearer to my heart's desire. His shining eyes held fast to the horizon, and he seemed to be listening for some sound that was wanting from that inland acreage, vocal as it was with the cheerful music of pastoral and farmland. You are not one of us, said the water rat, nor yet a farmer, nor even, I should judge, of this country. Right, replied the stranger. I'm a seafaring rat, I am, and the port I originally hailed from is Constantinople, though I'm sort of a foreigner there too, in a manner of speaking. You will have heard of Constantinople, friend. Fair city, and an ancient and glorious one, and you may have heard too of Sigurd, King of Norway, and how he sailed thither with 60 ships, and how he and his men rode up through streets all canopied in their honour with purple and gold, and how the emperor and empress came down and banqueted with them on board their ship. Whew, a lot of words. When Sigurd returned home, many of his Northmen remained behind, and entered the emperor's bodyguard, and my ancestor, a Norwegian-born, stayed behind too, with the ships that Sigurd gave the emperor. This is actually all very historically accurate. Constantinople's emperor did have a group of bodyguards who did originate from the Scandinavian countries. You see a little fact there. Where am I? Seafarers we have ever been, and no wonder. As for me, the city of my birth is no more my home than any pleasant port between there and the London River. I know them all, and they know me. Set me down on any of their quays or foreshores, and I am home again. I suppose you go on great voyages, said the water rat with growing interest. Months and months out of sight of land, and provisions running short, and allowance as to water, and your mind communing with the mighty ocean, and all that sort of thing? By no means, said the sea rat frankly. Such a life as you describe would not suit me at all. I'm in the coasting trade, and rarely out of sight of land. It's the jolly time on shore that appealed to me, as much as any seafaring. Oh, those southern seaports, the smell of them, the riding lights at night, the glamour. Well, perhaps you have chosen the better way, said the water rat, but rather doubtfully. Tell me something of your coasting, then, if you have a mind to, and what sort of harvest an animal of spirit might hope to bring home from it to warm his latter days with gallant memories by the fireside. For my life, I confess to you, feels to me today somewhat narrow and circumscribed. My last voyage, began the sea rat, that landed me eventually in this country, bound with high hopes for my inland farm, will serve as a good example of any of them, and indeed and indeed as an epitome of my highly coloured life. Family troubles, as usual, began it. The domestic storm cone was hoisted, and I shipped myself on board a small trading vessel bound from Constantinople by classic seas whose every wave throbs with a deathless memory to the Grecian islands and the Levant.
Oh, those were golden days and balmy nights. In and out of harbor all the time. Old friends everywhere. Sleeping in some cool temple or ruined cistern during the heat of the day. Feasting and song after sundown. Under great stars set in a velvet sky. Thence we turned and coasted up the Adriatic, its shores swimming in an atmosphere of amber, rosé, and aquamarine. We lay in wide land locked harbours. We roamed through ancient and noble cities, till at last one morning, as the sun rose royally behind us, we rode into Venice down a path of gold. Oh, Venice is a fine city, wherein a rat can wander at his ease and take his pleasure, or, when weary of wandering, can sit at the edge of the Grand Canal at night, feasting with his friends, when the air is full of music, and the sky full of stars, and the lights flash and shimmer on the polished steel prows of the swaying gondolas, packed so that you could walk across the canal on them from side to side. And then the food. Do you like shellfish? Well, well, we won't linger over that now. He was silent for a time, and the water rat silent too, and enthralled, floating on dream canals, and heard a phantom song pealing high between vaporous, grey wave lapped walls. Southwards we sailed again at last, continued the sea rat, coasting down the Italian shore, till finally we made Palermo, and there I quitted for a long happy spell on shore. I never stick too long to one ship. One gets narrow-minded and prejudiced. Besides, Sicily is one of my happy hunting grounds. I know everybody there, and their ways just suit me. I spent many jolly weeks in the island, staying with friends up country. When I grew restless again, I took advantage of a ship that was trading to Sardinia and Corsica, and very glad I was to feel the fresh breeze and the sea spray in my face once more. But isn't it very hot and stuffy down in the hold, I think you call it?" asked the water rat. The seafarer looked at him with a suspicious go-a-wink. "I'm an old hand," he remarked with much simplicity. "The captain's cabin's good enough for me." "It's a hard life, by all accounts," murmured the rat, sunk in deep thought. "For the crew it is," replied the seafarer gravely, again with the ghost of a wink. "From Corsica we went on. I made use of a ship that was taking wine to the mainland." "Oh, hello there, Sophia. Welcome, Sophia. Cozy stream. I need a nap." "All right. Well, welcome." We are just starting Wind of the Willows in our finale run. We have 4 chapters left, and we are on the first of those 4 chapters. From Corsica," he went on, "I made use of a ship that was taking wine to the mainland. We made a lesso in the evening, lay to, hauled up our wine casks, and hove them overboard, tied one to another by a long line. Then the crew took to the boats and rowed shorewards, singing as they went, and drawing after them the long bobbing procession of casks, like a mile of porpoises. On the sands they had horses waiting, which dragged the casks up the steep street of the little town with a fine rush, and clatter and scramble. When the last cask was in, we went and refreshed and rested, and sat late into the night, drinking with our friends, and next morning I took to the great olive woods for a spell and a rest. For now I had done with islands for the time, and ports and shipping were plentiful. So I led a lazy life among the peasants, lying and watching them work, or stretched high on the hillside with the blue Mediterranean far below me. And so at length, by easy stages, and partially on foot, partially by sea, to Marseille and the meeting of old shipmates, and the visiting of great ocean-bound vessels, and feasting once more, talk of shellfish, why sometimes I dream of the shellfish of Marseille, and wake up crying. That reminds me, said the polite water rat. You happened to mention that you were hungry, and I ought to have spoken earlier. Of course you will stop and take your midday meal with me. My hole is close by. It is some time past noon, and you are very welcome to whatever there is. Now I call that kind and brotherly of you, said the sea rat. I was indeed hungry when I sat down, and ever since I inadvertently happened to mention shellfish, my pains have been extreme. But couldn't you fetch it along out here? I am none too fond of going under hatches, unless I am obliged to, and then while we eat I could tell you more concerning my voyages, and the pleasant life I lead. At least it is very pleasant to me, and by your attention I judge it commends itself to you. Whereas if we go indoors, it is 100 to 1 that I shall presently fall asleep. That is indeed an excellent suggestion, said the water rat, and hurried off home. There he got out the luncheon basket and packed a simple meal, in which, remembering the stranger's origin and preferences, he took care to include a yard of long French bread, a sausage out of which the garlic sang, some cheese which lay down and cried, and a long-necked straw-covered flask, wherein lay bottled sunshine shed and garnered on far southern slopes. Thus laden, he returned with all speed, and blushed for judgment at the old seaman's commendations of his taste and judgment, as together they unpacked the basket and laid out the contents on the grass by the roadside. The sea rat, as soon as his hunger was somewhat assured, continued the history of his latest voyage, conducting his simple hearer from port to port of Spain, landing him in Lisbon, Oporto, and Bordeaux, introducing him to the pleasant harbors of Cornwall and Devon, and so up the channel to that final quayside, where, landing after winds long contrary and storm-driven and weather-beaten, he had caught the first magical hints and heraldings of another spring, and fired by these, had sped on a long tramp inland, hungry for the experiment of life on some quiet farmstead, very far from the weary beating of any sea. Spellbound and quivering with excitement, the water rat followed the adventurer league by league, over stormy bays, through crowded roadsteads, across harbor bars on a racing tide, up winding rivers that hid their busy little towns round a southern turn, and left him with a regretful sigh planted at his dull inland farm, about which he desired to hear nothing. By this time their meal was over, and the seafarer, refreshed and strengthened, his voice more vibrant, his eye lit with a brightness that seemed caught from some faraway sea beacon, filled his glass with the red and glowing vintage of the south, and leaning towards the water rat, compelled his gaze, and held him, body and soul, while he talked. Those eyes were of the changing foam-stricken grey-green of leaping northern seas. In the glass shone a hot ruby that seemed the very heart of the south, beating for him who had courage to respond to its pulsation. The twin lights, the shifting gray and the steadfast red, mastered the water rat and held him bound, fascinated, powerless. The quiet world outside their rays receded far away and ceased to be, and the wonderful talk, flowed on. Or was it speech entirely, or did it pass at times into song, chanty of the sailors weighing the dripping anchor, sonorous hum of the shrouds in a tearing northeaster, ballad of the fisherman hauling his nets at sundown against an apricot sky, chords of guitar and mandolin from gondola or difficult word to pronounce here, quay, did it change into the cry of the wind, plaintiful at first, angrily shrill as it freshened, rising to a tearing whistle, sinking to a musical trickle of air from the leach of the bellying sail. All these sounds the spellbound listeners seemed to hear, and with them the hungry complaint of the gulls and the sea-mews, the soft thunder of the breaking wave, the cry of the protesting shingle. Back into speech again it passed, and with beating heart he was following the adventures of a dozen seaports, the fights, the escapes, the rallies, the comradeships, the gallant undertakings, or he searched inland islands for treasure, fished in still lagoons, and dozed day long on warm white sand. Of deep sea fishings he heard tell, and mighty silver gatherings of the mile-long net, of sudden perils, noise of breakers on a moonless night, or the tall bows of the great liner taking shape overhead through the fog. Of the merry homecoming, the headland rounded, the harbor lights opened out, the groups seen dimly on the quay, the cheery hail, the splash of the hawser, the trudge up the steep little street towards the comforting glow of red curtained windows. Lastly, in his waking dream, it seemed to him that the adventurer had risen to his feet, but was still speaking, still holding him fast with his sea-gray eyes. "And now," he was softly saying, "I take to the road again, holding on south-westwards for many a long and dusty day, till at last I reach the little grey sea town I know so well, that clings along one steep side of the harbour. There, through dark doorways, you look down flights of stone steps, overhung by great pink tufts of vallion, and ending in a patch of sparkling blue water. The little boats that lie tethered to the rings and stanchions of the old sea-wall are gaily painted as those I clambered in and out in my own childhood. The salmon leap on the flood tide. Schools of mackerel flash and play past quaysides and foreshores, and by the windows of the great vessels glide, night and day, up to their moorings or forth to the open sea. There, sooner or later, the ships of all seafaring nations arrive, and there, at its destined hour, the ship of my choice will let go its anchor. I shall take my time, I shall tarry and bide, till at last the right one lies waiting for me, warped out into midstream, loaded low, her bowsprit pointing down harbour. I shall slip on board by boat or along hawser, and then one morning I shall wake to the song and tramp of the sailors, the clink of the capstan, and the rattle of the anchor chain coming merrily in. We shall break out the jib and the foresail, the white houses on the harbour side will glide slowly past us as she gathers steering way, and the voyage will have begun. As she forges towards the headland, she will clothe herself with canvas, and then once outside, the sounding slap of the great green seas as she heels to the wind, pointing south. Whew. Sorry, these are long paragraphs. And you will come too, young brother, for the day is past and never return, and the south still waits for you. Take the adventure, heed the call, now ere the irrevocable moment passes. 'Tis but a banging of the door behind you, a blithesome step forward, and you are out of the old life and into the new. Then some day long hence, jog home here if you will, when the cup has been drained and the play has been played, and sit down by your quiet river with a store of goodly memories for company. You can easily overtake me on the road, for you are young, and I am aging and go softly. I will linger and look back. At last I will surely see you coming, eager and light-hearted, with all the south in your face." The voice died away, and ceased as an insect's tiny trumpet dwindles swiftly into silence. And the water rat, paralyzed and staring, Saw at last but a distant speck on the white surface of the road. Mechanically he rose and proceeded to repack the luncheon basket carefully and without haste. Mechanically he returned home, gathered together a few small necessities and special treasures he was fond of, and put them in a satchel, acting with slow deliberation, moving about the room like a sleepwalker, listening ever with parted lips. He swung the satchel over his shoulder, carefully selected a stout stick for his wayfaring, and with no haste, but with no hesitation at all, he stepped across the threshold, just as the mole appeared at the door.
Why, where are you off to, Ratty?
Asked the mole in great surprise, grasping him by the arm.
Going south, with the rest of them,
Murmured the rat in a dreamy monotone, never looking at him.
Seaward first, and then on shipboard, and so to the shores that are calling me.
He pressed resolutely forward, still without haste, but with dogged fixity of purpose. But the mole, now thoroughly alarmed, placed himself in front of him, and looking into his eyes, saw that they were glazed and set, and turned a streaked and shifting gray. Not his friend's eyes, but the eyes of some other animal. Grappling with him strongly, he dragged him inside, threw him down, and held him. The rat struggled desperately for a few moments, and then his strength seemed suddenly to leave him, and he lay still and exhausted, with closed eyes trembling. Presently the mole assisted him to rise, and placed him in a chair, where he sat collapsed and shrunken into himself, his body shaken by a violent shivering, passing in time into a hysterical fit of dry sobbing. Mole made the door fast, threw the satchel into a drawer, and locked it, and sat down quietly on the table by his friend, waiting for the strange seizure to pass. Gradually the rat sank into a troubled doze, broken by starts and confused murmurings of things strange and wild and foreign to the unenlightened mole, and from that he passed into a deep slumber. Very anxious in mind, the mole left him for a time, and busied himself with household matters. It was getting dark when he returned to the parlor, and found the rat where he had left him, wide awake indeed, but listless, silent, and dejected. He took one hasty glance at his eyes, found them, to his great gratification, clear and dark and brown again as before, and then sat down and tried to cheer him up and help him to relate what had happened to him. Poor Ratty did his best by degrees to explain things, but how could he put into cold words what had mostly been suggestion? How recall for another's benefit the haunting sea voices that had sung to him? How reproduce at second hand the magic of the seafarer's 100 reminiscences? Even to himself now the spell was broken and the glamour gone. He found it difficult to account for what had seemed, some hours ago, the inevitable and only thing. It is not surprising, then, that he failed to convey to the mole any clear idea of what he had been through that day. To the mole, this much was plain. The fit or attack had passed away, and had left him sane again, though shaken and cast down by the reaction. But he seemed to have lost all interest for the time in the things that went to make up his daily life, as well as in all pleasant forecastings of the altered days and doings that the changing season was surely bringing. Casually, then, and with seemingly indifference, the mole turned his talk to the harvest that was being gathered in, the towering wagons and their straining teams, the growing ricks and the large moon rising over bare acres, dotted with sheaves. He talked of the reddening apples around, of the browning nuts, of jams and preserves and distilling of cordials, till by easy stages such as these, He reached midwinter, its hearty joys and its snug home life, and then he became simply lyrical. By degrees the rat began to sit up and to join in. His dull eyes brightened, and he lost some of his listening air. Presently the tactful mole slipped away, and returned with a pencil and a half sheets of paper, which he placed at his friend's elbow.
"It's quite a long time since you did any poetry,"
he remarked.
"You might have a try at it this evening, instead of, well, brooding over things so much. I've an idea that you'll feel a lot better when you've got something jotted down, if it's only just the rhymes."
The rat pushed the paper away from him wearily, but the discreet mole took occasion to leave the room, and when he peeped in again some time later, the rat was absorbed and deaf to the world, alternately scribbling and sucking the top of his pencil. It is true that he sucked a good deal more than he scribbled, but it was joy to the mole to know that the cure had at last begun. I kind of feel sorry for the rat there. I mean, obviously he wanted to leave, and Mole did stop him from doing the thing he wanted, but also at the same time, I can understand the mole not wanting to lose his friend to what he saw as a strange occurrence. It's time to catch up with the other plot at hand. Chapter 10: The Further Adventures of Toad. The front door of the hollow tree faced eastwards, so Toad was called at an early hour, partly by the bright sunlight streaming in on him, partly by the exceeding coldness of his toes, which made him dream that he was at home in bed in his own handsome room, with a Tudor window on a cold winter's night, and his bedclothes had got up, grumbling and protesting that they couldn't stand the cold any longer, and had run downstairs to the kitchen fire to warm themselves, and he had followed, on bare feet, along miles and miles of icy stone-paved passages, arguing and beseeching them to be reasonable. He would probably have been aroused much earlier, had he not slept for some weeks on straw over stone flags, and almost forgotten the friendly feeling of thick blankets pulled well up round the chin. Julian. Ah, good old Toad. Yes, good old Toad. Sitting up, he rubbed his eyes first, and his complaining toes next, wondered for a moment where he was, looked round for familiar stone wall and little barred window, then with a leap of the heart remembered everything. His escape, his flight, his pursuit, remembered first and best thing of all that he was free. Free! The word and the thought alone was worth 50 blankets. He was warm from end to end as he thought of the jolly world outside, waiting eagerly for him to make his triumphal entrance, ready to serve him and play up to him, anxious to help him and to keep him company, as it always had been in days of old before misfortune fell upon him. He shook himself and combed the dry leaves out of his hair with his fingers. Wait, Toad has hair? Weird. And his toilet complete. Well, I know what they mean, but it's still an odd word here. Marched forth into the comfortable morning sun, cold but confident, hungry but hopeful, all nervous terrors of yesterday dispelled by rest and sleep and frank and heartening sunshine. He had the world all to himself that early summer morning. The dewy woodland, as he threaded it, was solitary and still. The green fields that succeeded the trees were his own to do as he liked with. The road itself, when he reached it, in that loneliness that was everywhere, seemed like a stray dog to be looking anxiously for company. Toad, however, was looking for something that could talk, and tell him clearly which way he ought to go. It is all very well when you have a light heart, excuse me, and a clear conscience and money in your pocket, and nobody scouring the country for you to drag you off to prison again, to follow where the road beckons and points, not caring whither. The practical Toad cared very much indeed, and he could have kicked the road for its helpless silence when every minute was of importance to him. The reserved rustic road was presently joined by a shy little brother in the shape of a canal, which took its hand and ambled along by its side in perfect confidence, but with the same tongue-tied, uncommunicative attitude towards strangers. "Bother them!" said Toad to himself. "But anyhow, one thing's clear. They must both be coming from somewhere, and going to somewhere. You can't get over that, Toad, my boy." So he marched on patiently by the water's edge. Round a bend in the canal came plodding a solitary horse, stooped forward as if in anxious thought. From rope traces attached to his collar stretched a long line, taut, but dipping with his stride, the further part of its dripping pearly drops. Toad let the horse pass and stood waiting for what the fates were sending him. With a pleasant swirl of quiet water at its blunt bow, the barge slid up alongside of him, its gaily painted gunwale level with the towing path. Yeah. Firefly, there are some kinds of frogs with hair, or at least something that looks hair-like. Oh, interesting. I did not know that. That's an interesting fact. Its gaily painted gunwale level with the towing path. Its sole occupant a big, stout woman, wearing a linen sunbonnet, one brawny arm laid along the tiller. "A nice morning, ma'am," she remarked to Toad as she drew up level with him. "I dare say it is, ma'am," responded Toad politely, as he walked along the tow path abreast of her. "I dare it is a nice morning to them that's not in sore trouble, like what I am. Here's my merry daughter. She sends me off to me post-haste to come to her at once. So off I comes, not knowing what may be happening or going to happen, but fearing the worst, as you will understand, ma'am, if you're a mother too, and I've left my business to look after itself. I'm in the washing and laundering line, you must know, ma'am, and I've left my young children to look after themselves. A more mischievous and troublesome set of young imps doesn't exist, ma'am, and I've lost all my money and lost my way, and for what may be happening to my merry daughter, why, I don't like to think of it, ma'am." Where might your merry daughter be living, ma'am?" asked the barge woman. "She lives near to the river, ma'am," replied Toad, "close to a fine house called Toad Hall, that's somewheres hereabouts in these parts. Perhaps you may have heard of it." "Toad Hall? Why, I'm going that way myself," replied the barge woman. "This canal joins the river some miles further on, a little above Toad Hall, and then it's an easy walk. You come along in the barge with me, and I'll give you a lift." She steered the barge close to the bank, and Toad, with many humble and grateful acknowledgments, stepped lightly on board and sat down with great satisfaction. "Toad's luck again," thought he. "I always come out on top." Excuse me. "So you're in the washing business, ma'am," said the barge woman politely as they glided along. "And a very good business you've got too, I dare say, if I'm not making too free in saying so." "Finest business in the whole country," said Toad airily. "All the all the gentry come to me. Wouldn't go to anyone else if they were paid. They know me so well. You see, I understand my work thoroughly, and attend to it all myself. Washing, ironing, clear starching, making up gents' fine shirts for evening wear. Everything's done under my own eyes. I have a feeling Toad's about to put his foot in his mouth here.
But surely you don't do all that work yourself, ma'am?
Asked the barge woman respectfully.
Oh, I have girls, said Toad lightly. 20 girls or thereabouts, always at work. But you know what girls are, ma'am. Nasty little hussies, that's what I call 'em.
Nice.
So do I too, said the barge woman with great heartiness. But I dare say you set yourselves to rights, the idle trollops. And are you very fond of washing?
I love it, said Toad.
I simply dote on it. Never so happy as when I've got both arms in the washtub. But then it comes so easily to me. No trouble at all. A real pleasure, I assure you, ma'am. What a bit of luck meeting you, observed the barge woman thoughtfully. A regular piece of good fortune for both of us.
Why? What do you mean? Asked Toad nervously.
Well, look at me now, replied the barge woman. I like washing too, just the same as you do. And for that matter, whether I like it or not, I have got to do it all my own, naturally, moving about as I do. Now my husband, he's such a fellow for shirking his work and leaving the barge to me, that never a moment do I get foreseen to my own affairs. By rights, he ought to be here now, either steering, or attending to the horse, though luckily the horse has sense enough to attend to itself, instead of which he's gone off with a dog to see if they can't pick up a rabbit for dinner somewhere. Says he'll catch me up at the next lock. Well, that's as may be. I don't trust him. Once he gets off with that dog, who's worse than he is. But meantime, how am I to get on with my washing?
Oh, never mind about the washing, said Toad, not liking the subject.
Try and fix your mind on that rabbit. A nice fat young rabbit, I'll be bound. Got any onions? I can't fix my mind on anything but my washing, said the barge woman. And I wonder you can be talking of rabbits with such a joyful prospect before you. There's a heap of things of mine that you'll find in a corner of the cabin, if you'll just take one or two of the most necessary sort. I won't venture to describe them to a lady like you, but you'll recognize them at a glance, and put them through the wash-tub as we go along. Why, it'll be a pleasure to you, as you rightly say, and a real help to me. You'll find a tub handy and a soap, and a kettle on the stove, and a bucket to haul up water for the canal with. Then I shall know you're enjoying yourself, instead of sitting here idle, looking at the scenery and yawning your head off. Here, you let me stare, said Toad, now thoroughly frightened, and then you can get on with your washing your own way. I might spoil your things, or not do 'em as you like. I'm more used to gentlemen's things myself. It's my special line. Let you steer? Replied the barge woman, laughing. It takes some practice to steer a barge properly. Besides, it's dull work, and I want you to be happy. No, you shall do the washing you are so fond of, and I'll stick to the steering that I understand. Don't try and deprive me of the pleasure of giving you a treat.
Oh, poor Toad. Oh. That's what you get when you have an eagle like that. Toad was fairly concerned. Toad was fairly cornered. He looked for escape this way and that, saw that he was too far from the bank for a flying leap, and sullenly resigned himself to his fate.
If it comes to that, he thought in desperation, I suppose any fool can wash.
He fetched tub, soap, and other necessities from the cabin, selected a few garments at random, tried to recollect what he had seen in casual glances through laundry windows, and set to. A long half hour passed, and every minute of it saw Toad getting crosser and crosser. Nothing that he could do to the things seemed to please them or do them good. He tried coaxing, he tried slapping, he tried punching. They smiled back at him out of the tub unconverted, happy in their original sin. Once or twice he looked nervously over his shoulder at the bargewoman, but she appeared to be gazing out in front of her, absorbed in her steering. His back ached badly, and he noticed with dismay that his paws were beginning to get all crinkly. Now, Toad was very proud of his paws. He muttered under his breath words that should never pass the lips of either washerwoman or Toads, and lost the soap for the 50th time. A burst of laughter made him straighten himself and look round. The bargewoman was leaning back and laughing unrestrainedly till the tears ran down her cheeks.
I've been watching you all the time, she gasped. I thought you must be a humbug all along, from the conceited way you talked. Pretty washerwoman you are. Never washed so much as a dishcloth in your life, I'll lay.
Toad's temper, which had been simmering viciously for some time, now fairly boiled over, and he lost all control of himself.
You common, low-fat bargewoman, he shouted. Don't you dare talk to your betters like that. Washerwoman indeed! I would have you know that I am a Toad, a very well-known, respected, distinguished Toad. I may be under a bit of a cloud at present, but I will not be laughed at by a bargewoman.
The woman moved nearer to him and peered under his bonnet keenly and closely.
Why, so you are, she cried. Well, I never! A horrid, nasty, crawly Toad! And in my nice, clean barge, too! Now that is a thing that I will not have.
She relinquished the tiller for a moment. One big mottled arm shot out and caught Toad by a foreleg, while the other gripped him fast by a hind leg. Then the world turned suddenly upside down. The barge seemed to flit lightly across the sky. The wind whistled in his ears, and Toad found himself flying through the air, revolving rapidly as he went. Well, that's what you get for lying to someone like that. The water, when he eventually reached it with a loud splash, proved quite cold enough for his taste, though its chill was not sufficient to quell his proud spirit, or slake the heat of his furious temper. He rose to the surface spluttering, and when he had wiped the duckweed out of his eyes, the first thing he saw was the fat bargewoman, looking back at him over the stern of the retreating barge and laughing, and he vowed as he coughed and choked to be even with her. He struck out for the shore, but the cotton gown greatly impeded his efforts, and when at length he touched land, he found it hard to climb up the steep bank unassisted. He had to take a minute or two rest to recover his breath. Then, gathering his wet skirts well over his arms, he started to run after the barge as fast as his legs would carry him, wild with indignation, thirsting for revenge. The bargewoman was still laughing when he drew up level with her.
Put yourself through your mangle, washerwoman, she called out, and iron your face and crimp it, and you'll pass for quite a decent-looking Toad.
Toad never paused to reply. Solid revenge was what he wanted, not cheap, windy verbal triumphs, though he had a thing or two in his mind that he would have liked to say. He saw what he wanted ahead of him. Running swiftly on, he overtook the horse, unfastened the tow rope, and cast off, jumped lightly on the horse's back, and urged it to a gallop by kicking it vigorously in the sides. He steered for the open country, abandoning the tow path, and swinging his steed down a rutty lane. Once he looked back and saw that the barge had run aground on the other side of the canal, and that the bargewoman was gesticulating wildly and shouting, "Stop! Stop! Stop!" "I've heard that song before," said Toad, laughing as he continued to spur his steed onward in its wild career. The barge horse was not capable of any sustained effort, and its gallop soon subsided into a trot, and its trot into an easy walk. But Toad was quite contented with this, knowing that he, at any rate, was moving, and the barge was not. He had quite recovered his temper, now that he had done something he thought really clever, and he was satisfied to jog along quietly in the sun, steering his horse along byways and bridle paths, and trying to forget how very long it was since he had had a square meal, till the canal had been left very far behind him. He had traveled some miles, his horse and he was feeling drowsy in the hot sunshine, when the horse stopped, lowered his head, and began to nibble the grass, and Toad, waking up, just saved himself from falling off by an effort. Kintron, Grand Theft Auto, horse theft, Toad's got a good record going, yes! Oh, well, he did say he did have a cloud over his head, so... Well, he is quite the distinguished criminal, this Mr. Toad now. He looked about him, and found he was on a wide common, dotted with patches of gorse and bramble as far as he could see. Near him stood a dingy gypsy caravan, and beside it a man was sitting on a bucket turned upside down, very busy smoking and staring into the wide world. A fire of sticks was burning nearby, and over the fire hung an iron pot, and out of that pot came forth bubblings and gurglings and a vague suggestive steaminess. Also smells, warm, rich, and varied smells, that twined and twisted and wreathed themselves at last into one complete, voluptuous, perfect smell, that seemed like the very soul of nature taking form, and appearing to her children, a true goddess, a mother of solace and comfort. Toad now knew well that he had not been really hungry before. What he had felt earlier in the day had been a mere trifling qualm. This was the real thing at last, and no mistake, it would have to be dealt with, speedily too, or there would be trouble for somebody or something. He looked the gypsy over carefully, wondering vaguely whether it would be easier to fight him or cajole him. So there he sat and sniffed and looked at the gypsy, and the gypsy sat and smoked and looked at him. Presently the gypsy took his pipe out of his mouth and remarked in a careless way, "Want to sell that there horse of yours?" Toad was completely taken aback. He did not know that gypsies were very fond of horse dealing, and never missed an opportunity, and he had not reflected that caravans were always on the move and took a deal of drawing. It had not occurred to him to turn the horse into cash, but the gypsy's suggestion seemed to smooth the way towards the two things he wanted so badly: ready money and a solid breakfast. "What?" he said. "Me sell this beautiful young horse of mine? Oh no, it's out of the question. Who's going to take the washing home to my customers every week? Besides, I'm too fond of him, and he simply dotes on me." "Try and love a donkey," suggested the gypsy. "Some people do." "You don't seem to see," continued Toad. that this fine horse of mine is a cut above you altogether. Wow, he really is egotistical. He's a blood horse, he is, partly. Not the part you see, of course, another part. He's been a prize hackney, too, in his time. That was the time before you knew him, but you can still tell it on him at a glance. If you understand anything about horses, no, it's not to be thought of for a moment. All the same, how much might you be disposed to offer me for this beautiful young horse of mine? The gypsy looked the horse over, and then he looked Toad over with equal care, and looked at the horse again. "Shilling a leg," he said briefly, and turned away, continuing to smoke and try to stare the wide world out of countenance. "A shilling a leg!" cried Toad. "If you please! It must take a little time to work that out, and see just what it comes to." He climbed down off his horse and left it to graze, and sat down by the gypsy and did sums on his fingers, and at last he said, "A shilling a leg? Why, that comes to exactly 4 shillings, and no more. Oh, no, I could not think of accepting 4 shillings for this beautiful young horse of mine." "Well," said the gypsy, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make it 5 shillings, and that's 3 and 6 pence more than the animal's worth, and that's my last word." Then Toad sat and pondered long and deeply, for he was hungry and quite penniless, and still some way, he knew not how far, from home, and enemies might still be looking for him. To one in such a situation, 5 shillings may very well appear a large sum of money. On the other hand, it did not seem very much to get for a horse. But then, again, the horse hadn't cost him anything, so whatever he got was all clear profit. At last, he said firmly, "Look here, gypsy, I tell you what we will do, and this is my final word. You shall hand me over 6 shillings and 6 pence, cash down, and further, in addition thereto, you shall give me as much breakfast as I can possibly eat. At one sitting, of course, out of that iron pot of yours that keeps sending forth such delicious and exciting smells. In return, I will make over to you my spirited young horse, with all the beautiful harness and trappings that are on him, freely thrown in. If that's not good enough for you, say so, and I'll be getting on. I know a man near here who's wanted this horse of mine for years." The gypsy grumbled frightfully, and declared if he did a few more deals of that sort he'd be ruined. But in the end he lugged a dirty canvas bag out of the depths of his trouser pocket, and counted out 6 shillings and 6 pence into Toad's paw. Then he disappeared in the caravan for an instant, and returned with a large iron plate, and a knife, fork, and spoon. He tilted up the pot, and a glorious stream of hot, rich stew gurgled into the plate. It was, indeed, the most beautiful stew in the world, being made of partridges, and pheasants, and chickens, and hares, and rabbits, and peahens, and guinea fowl, and 1 or 2 other things. That does sound delicious, I will admit. Toad took the plate on his lap, almost crying, and stuffed and stuffed and stuffed, and kept asking for more. And the gypsy never grudged it him. He thought that he had never eaten so good a breakfast in all his life. When Toad had taken as much stew on board as he thought he could possibly hold, he got up and said good-bye to the gypsy, and took an affectionate farewell of the horse. And the gypsy, who knew the riverside well, gave him directions which way to go, and he set forth on his travels again in the best possible spirits. He was indeed a very different Toad from the animal of an hour ago. The sun was shining brightly. His wet clothes were quite dry again. He had money in his pocket once more. He was nearing home and friends and safety. And most and best of all, he had had a substantial meal, hot and nourishing, and felt big and strong and careless and self-confident. As he tramped along gaily, he thought of his adventures and escapes, and when things seemed at their worst, he had always managed to find a way out, and his pride and conceit began to swell within him. "Ho, ho!" he said to himself as he marched along with his chin in the air. "What a clever toad I am! There is surely no animal equal to me for cleverness in the whole world. My enemies shut me up in prison, encircled by sentries, watched night and day by warders. I walked out through them all by sheer ability coupled with courage. They pursue me with engines and policemen and revolvers. I snap my fingers at them and vanish laughing into space. I am unfortunately thrown into a canal by a woman fat of body and very evil-minded. And what of it? I swim ashore, I seize her horse, I ride off in triumph, and I sell the horse for a whole pocketful of money and an excellent breakfast. Ho, ho! I am the toad, the handsome, the popular, the successful toad." Oh, Toad's voice is hard to keep track of. He got so puffed up with conceit that he made up a song as he walked in praise of himself, and sang it at the top of his voice, though there was no one to hear it but him. It was perhaps the most conceited song that any animal ever composed. Here we go with a song, my dear scholars. Let's see if I can do a tune to this. "The world has held great heroes, as history books have shown, but never a name to go down to fame compared with that of Toad. The clever men at Oxford know all there is to be known, but they none of them know one half as much as intelligent Mr. Toad. The animals sat in the ark and cried their tears and torrents flowed. Who was it said, 'There's land ahead,' encouraging Mr. Toad? The army all saluted as they marched along the road. Was it the king or the Kitchener? No, it was Mr. Toad. The queen and the ladies in waiting sat in the window and sewed. She cried, 'Look who's that handsome man!' They answered, 'Mr. Toad!'" There was a great deal more of the same sort, but too dreadfully conceited to be written down. These are some of the milder verses. Oh, thank you. Thank you. He sang as he walked, and he walked as he sang, and got more inflated every minute. But his pride was shortly to have a severe fall. After some miles of country lanes, he reached the high road, and as he turned into it, and glanced along its white length, he saw approaching him a speck that turned into a dot, and then into a blob, and then into something very familiar, and a doable note of warning, only too well known, fell on his delighted ear. "This is something like," said the excited Toad. "This is a real life again. This is once more the great world from which I have been missed so long. I will hail them, my brothers of the wheel, and pitch them a yarn of the sort that has been so successfully hitherto, and they will give me a lift, of course, and then I will talk to them some more, and perhaps with luck it may even end in my driving up to Toad Hall in a motor car. That will be one in the eye for Badger." He stepped confidently out into the road to hail the motor car, which came along at an easy pace, slowing down as it neared the lane, when suddenly he became very pale. His heart turned to water, his knees shook and yielded under him, and he doubled up and collapsed with a sickening pain in his interior. And well he might, the unhappy animal, for the approaching car was the very one he had stolen out of the yard of the Red Lion Hotel on that fatal day when all his troubles began. And the people in it were the very same people he had sat and watched at luncheon at the coffee house. He sank down in a shabby, miserable heap in the road, murmuring to himself in his despair, "It's all up. It's all over now. Chains and policemen again. Prison again. Dry bread and water again. Oh, what a fool I have been! What did I want to go strutting about the country for, singing conceited songs and hailing people in broad day on the high road, instead of hiding till nightfall and slipping home quietly by backways? Oh, helpless Toad! Oh, ill-fated animal!" The terrible motor car drew slowly nearer and nearer, till at last he heard it stop just short of him. Two gentlemen got out and walked round the trembling heap of crumpled misery laying in the road, and one of them said, "Oh dear, this is very sad. Here's a poor old thing, a washerwoman apparently, who has fainted in the road. Perhaps she is overcome by the heat, poor creature, or possibly she has not had any food today. Let us lift her into the car and take her to the nearest village, where doubtless she has friends." They tenderly lifted Toad into the motor car and propped him up with soft cushions, and proceeded on their way. When Toad heard them talking in so kind and sympathetic a way, and knew that he was not recognized, his courage began to revive, and he cautiously opened first one eye and then the other. "Look," said one of the gentlemen, "she is better now, better already. The fresh air is doing her good. How do you feel now, ma'am?"
"Thank you kindly, sir," said Toad in a feeble voice. "I'm feeling a great deal better."
"That's right. Now keep quite still."
"That's right," said the gentleman. "Now keep quite still, and above all, don't try to talk." "I won't," said Toad. "I was only thinking if I might sit on the front seat there, beside the driver, where I could get the fresh air full in my face. I should soon be all right again."
"What a very sensible woman," said the gentleman. "Of course you shall." So they carefully helped Toad into the front seat beside the driver, and on they went again. Toad was almost himself again by now. He sat up, looking about him, and tried to beat down the tremors, the yearnings, the old cravings that rose up and beset him, and took possession of him entirely. "It is fate," he said to himself. "Why strive? Why struggle?" And he turned to the driver at his side.
"Please, sir," he said, "I wish you would kindly let me try and drive the car for a little. I've been watching you carefully, and it looks so easy and so interesting. And I should like to be able to tell my friends that once I had driven a motor car."
The driver laughed at the proposal so heartily that the gentleman inquired what the matter was. When he heard, he said to Toad's delight, "Bravo, ma'am, I like your spirit. Let her have a try and look after her. She won't do any harm." Toad eagerly scrambled in the seat vacated by the driver, took the steering wheel in his hands, listened with affected humility to the instructions given him, and set the car in motion, but very slowly and carefully at first, for he was determined to be prudent. The gentlemen behind clapped their hands and applauded, and Toad heard them saying, "How well she does it! Fancy a washerwoman driving a car as well as that the first time!" Toad went a little faster, then faster still, and faster. He heard the gentleman call out warningly, "Be careful, washerwoman!" and this annoyed him, and he began to lose his head. The driver tried to interfere, but he pinned him down in his seat with one elbow, and put on full speed. The rush of the air in his face, the hum of the engines, and the light jump of the car beneath him intoxicated his weak brain. "Washerwoman indeed!" he shouted recklessly. "Hot! Ho! I am the Toad! The motorcar snatcher, the prison breaker, the Toad who always escapes! Sit still and you shall know what driving really is, for you are in the hands of the famous, the skillful, the entirely fearless Toad!" Wow, he is nuts. I will say that. With a cry of horror, the whole party rose and flung themselves on him. "Seize him!" they cried. "Seize the Toad, the wicked animal who stole our motor car! Bind him, chain him, drag him to the nearest police station! Down with the desperate and dangerous Toad!" Alas, they should have thought. They ought to have been more prudent. They should have remembered to stop the motor car somehow before playing any pranks of that sort. With a half turn of the wheel, the Toad sent the car crashing through the low hedge that ran along the roadside. One mighty bound and a violent shock, and the wheels of the car were churning up the thick mud of the horse pond. Toad found himself flying through the air with the strong upward rush and delicate curve of a swallow. He liked the motion, and was just beginning to wonder whether it would go on until he developed wings and turned into a toad bird, when he landed on his back with a thump in the soft rich grass of a meadow. Sitting up, he could see the motor car in the pond, nearly submerged. The gentleman and the driver, encumbered by their lawn coats, were floundering helplessly in the water. He picked himself up rapidly and set off running across country as hard as he could, scrambling through hedges, jumping ditches, pounding across fields, till he was breathless and weary and had to settle down into an easy walk. When he had recovered his breath somewhat and was able to think calmly, he began to giggle, and from giggling he took to laughing, and he laughed till he had to sit down under a hedge. "Oh, oh!" he cried in ecstasies of self-admiration. "Toad again! Toad as usual! Comes out on top! Who was it got them to give him a lift? Who managed to get on the front seat for the sake of fresh air? Who persuaded them into letting him see if he could drive? Who landed them all in a horse pond? Who escaped flying gaily and unscathed through the air, leaving the narrow-minded, grudging, timid excursionists in the mud where they should rightly be? Why, Toad, of course! Clever Toad, great Toad, good Toad!" I wouldn't say good, but oh well. Then he burst into song again and chanted with uplifted voice. Oh, this lyric is precious. "The motor car went poop, poop, poop as it raced along the road. Who was it steered it into a pond? Ingenious Mr. Toad! Oh, how clever I am! How clever, how very clever!" A slight noise at a distance behind him made him turn his head and look. Oh horror! Oh misery! Oh despair! About 2 fields off, a chauffeur in his leather gaiters and 2 large rural policemen were visible, running towards him as hard as they could. Poor Toad sprang to his feet and pelted away again, his heart in his mouth. "Oh my!" he gasped as he panted along. "What an ass I am! What a conceited and heedless ass! Swaggering again, shouting and singing songs again, sitting still and gassing again! Oh my, oh my, oh my!" He glanced back and saw to his dismay that they were gaining on him. On he ran desperately, but kept looking back and saw that they still gained steadily. He did his best, but he was a fat animal, and his legs were short, and still they gained. He could hear them close behind him. Ceasing to heed where he was going, he struggled on blindly and wildly, looking back over his shoulder at the now triumphant enemy, when suddenly the earth failed under his feet. He grasped at the air, and splash! He found himself head over ears in deep water, rapid water, water that bore him along with a force he could not contend with, and he knew that in his blind panic he had run straight into the river. He rose to the surface and tried to grasp the reeds and the rushes that grew along the water's edge, close under the bank, but the stream was so strong that it tore them out of his hands. "Oh my!" gasped poor Toad. "If I steal a motor car again, if I sing another conceited song." Then down he went, and came up breathless and sputtering. Presently he saw that he was approaching a big dark hole in the bank, just above his head, and as the stream bore him past, he reached up with a paw, and caught hold of the edge, and held on. Then slowly, and with difficulty, he drew himself up out of the water, till at last he was able to rest his elbows on the edge of the hole. Then he remained for some minutes, puffing and panting, for he was quite exhausted. As he sighed and blew and stared before him into the dark hole, some bright small thing shone and twinkled in its depths, moving towards him. As it approached, a face grew up gradually around it, and it was a familiar face, brown and small, with whiskers, grave and round, with neat ears and silky hair. It was the water rat. All right, my dear scholars, we have 2 chapters left to do in this book. We will do them presently, but first I'm going to take a short break so I can regain a little bit of my energy, and I will be right back to continue and finish off the Wind in the Willows. I'll see you then in just a few moments. dear scholars. Oh. I almost forgot my mic. Oh my goodness, oh my goodness. Sorry about that. I am back, my dear scholars. Oh, excuse me. Oh, thank you, Julian. Thank you. I had to, whew. This is a bit of a marathon run through this book, I will admit. Um, oh, thank you for the welcome back, Firefly. Thank you. Um, yeah, I wanted to finish this book tonight because I will say ahead of time, the next few weeks I could not find a suitable point to read the last two chapters. So I decided I'd read them all tonight because coming the start of December, I have a very, very, very special reading stream that I will be doing for that entire month. I will talk about it later after after the stream. But I digress, my dear scholars. I hope you are all relaxing. I hope you are all feeling well, and I hope you're all ready for these last two chapters as we find out what just happened to Toad and what is going to happen in the final two chapters of The Wind in the Willows. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. There's still a little bit of dust, still a little bit of dust, and the snow has caused the air to dry out a little bit in this room, so it gives me a tendency to cough, unfortunately. Chapter 11. Like spring tempests came his tears. The rat put out a neat little brown paw, gripped Toad firmly by the scruff of the neck, and gave a great hoist and a pull, and the waterlogged Toad came up slowly but surely over the edge of the hole, till at last he stood safe and sound in the hall, streaked with mud and weed to be sure, and with the water streaming off him, but happy and high-spirited as of old, now that he had found himself once more in the house of a friend, and dodgings and evasions were over, and he could lay aside a disguise that was unworthy of his position, and wanted such a lot of living up to. "Oh, Ratty!" he cried, "I've been through such times since I saw you last, you can't think! Such trials, such sufferings, and all so nobly borne! Then such escapes, such disguises, such subterfuges, and all so cleverly planned and carried out! Been in prison, got out of it, of course, been thrown in a canal, swam ashore, stole a horse, sold him for a large sum of money, humbugged everybody, made 'em do exactly what I wanted." Now that's I believe the term is BS. He is, yes, that is complete and utter yes. "Oh, I am a smart Toad, and no mistake. What do you think my last exploit was? Just hold on till I tell you." "Toad," said the water rat gravely and firmly, "you go off upstairs at once, and take off that old cotton rag that looks as if it might formerly have belonged to some washerwoman, and clean yourself thoroughly, and put on some of my clothes, and try and come down looking like a gentleman if you can. For a more shabby, bedraggled, disreputable-looking object than you are, I never set eyes on in my whole life. Now stop swaggering and arguing, and be off. I'll have something to say to you later." Toad was at first inclined to stop and do some talking back at him. He had had enough of being ordered about when he was in prison, and here was the thing being begun all over again, apparently, and by a rat too. However, he caught sight of himself in the looking-glass over the hat-stand, with the rusty black bonnet perched rakishly over one eye, and he changed his mind and went very quickly and humbly upstairs to the rat's dressing-room. There he had a thorough wash and brush-up, changed his clothes, and stood for a long time before the glass, contemplating himself with pride and pleasure, and thinking what utter idiots all the people must have been to have ever mistaken him for one moment for a washerwoman. By the time he came down again, luncheon was on the table, and very glad Toad was to see it, for he had been through some trying experiences, and had taken much hard exercise since the excellent breakfast provided for him by the gypsy. While they ate, Toad told the rat all his adventures, dwelling chiefly on his own cleverness, and presence of mind in emergencies, and cunning in tight places, and rather making out that he had been having a gay and highly colored experience. But the more he talked and boasted, the more grave and silent the rat became. When at last Toad had talked himself to a standstill, there was silence for a while, and then Rat said, "Now, Toady, I don't want to give you pain, after all you've been through already, but seriously, don't you see what an awful ass you've been making of yourself? On your own admission, you have been handcuffed, imprisoned, starved, chased, terrified out of your life, insulted, jeered at, and ignominiously flung into the water. By a woman, too. Where's the amusement in that? Where does the fun come in? And all because you must needs go and steal a motor car. You know that you've never had anything but trouble from motor cars from the moment you first set eyes on one. But if you will be mixed up with them, as you generally are, 5 minutes after you've started, why steal them? Be a cripple if you think it's exciting. Be a bankrupt for a change, if you've set your mind on it. But why choose to be a convict, when you are going to be sensible and think of your friends and try and be a credit to them? Do you suppose it's any pleasure to me, for instance, to hear animals saying as I go about that I'm the chap that keeps company with gull-birds? Now, it was a very comforting point in Toad's character that he was a thoroughly good-hearted animal, and never minded being jawed by those who were his real friends. And even when most set upon a thing, he was always able to see the other side of the question. So although, while the rat was talking so seriously, he kept saying to himself mutinously, "But it was fun, though, awful fun," and making strange suppressed noises inside him, kick, 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 and poop, 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 and other sounds resembling stifled snorts or the openings of soda water bottles. Yet when the rat had quite finished, he heaved a deep sigh and said very nicely and humbly, "Quite right, Ratty. How sound you always are! Yes, I've been a conceited old ass, I can quite see that. But now I'm going to be a good Toad and not do it any more. As for motor cars, I've not been at all so keen about them since my last ducking in that river of yours. The fact is, while I was hanging on to the edge of your hole, and getting my breath, I had a sudden idea, a really brilliant idea, connected with motor boats. There, don't take on so, old chap, and stamp and upset things. It was only an idea. We won't talk any more about it now. We'll have our coffee and a smoke and a quiet chat. Then I'm going to stroll quietly down to Toad Hall and get into clothes of my own and set things going again on the old lines. I've had enough adventures. I shall lead a quiet, steady, respectful life, pottering about my property and improving it, and down a little landscape gardening at times. There will always be a bit of dinner for my friends when they come to see me, and I shall keep a pony chaise to jog about the country in, just as I used to do in the good old days, before I got restless and wanted to do things." "Stroll quietly down to Toad Hall?" cried the rat, greatly excited. "What are you talking about? Do you mean to say you haven't heard?" "Heard what?" said Toad, turning rather pale. "Go on, Ratty. Quick, don't spare me. What haven't I heard?" "Do you mean to tell me," shouted the rat, thumping with his little fists upon the table. "That you've heard nothing about the Stouts and Weasels?" "What? The Wild Wooders?" cried Toad, trembling in every limb. "No, not a word. What have they been doing?" "And how they've been and taken Toad Hall," continued the rat. Toad leaned his elbows on the table and his chin on his paws, and a large tear welled up in each of his eyes, overflowed, and splashed on the table. Plop, plop. "Go on, Ratty," he murmured presently. "Tell me all. The worst is over. I am an animal again. I can bear it." When you got into that trouble of yours," said the rat slowly and impressively. "I mean when you disappeared from society for a time, over that misunderstanding about a machine, you know." Toad merely nodded. "Well, it was a good deal talked about down here, naturally," continued the rat. "Not only along the riverside, but even in the wild wood. Animals took sides, as always happens. The river bankers stuck up for you, and said you had been infamously treated, and there was no justice to be had in the land nowadays. But the wild wood animals said hard things, and served you right, and it was time this sort of thing was stopped. They got very cocky, and went about saying you were done for this time. You would never come back again. Never, never." Toad nodded once more, keeping silence. That's the sort of little beasts they are," the rat went on. "But Mole and Badger, they stuck out, through thick and thin, that you would come back again soon somehow. They didn't know exactly how, but somehow." Toad began to sit up in his chair again and to smirk a little. "They argued from history," continued the rat. "They said that no criminal laws had ever been known to prevail against cheek and plausibility such as yours, combined with the power of a lawn purse. So they arranged to move their things in to Toad Hall, and sleep there, and keep it aired, and have it all ready for you when you turned up. They didn't guess what was going to happen, of course. Still, they had their suspicions of the wild wood animals. Now I come to the most painful and tragic part of my story. One dark night, it was a very dark night, and blowing hard too, and raining simply cats and dogs, and a band of weasels, armed to the teeth, crept silently up the carriage drive to the front entrance. Simultaneously a body of desperate ferrets, advancing through the kitchen garden, possessed themselves of the backyard and offices, while a company of skirmishing Stouts, who stuck at nothing, occupied the conservatory and the billiard room, and held the French windows opening on to the lawn. The Mole and the Badger were sitting by the fire in the smoking room, telling stories and suspecting nothing, for it wasn't a night for any animals to be out in, when those bloodthirsty villains broke down the doors and rushed in upon them from every side. They made the best fight they could, but what was the good? They were unarmed and taken by surprise, and what can two animals do against hundreds? They took and beat them severely with sticks, those two poor faithful creatures, and turned them out into the cold and the wet, with many insulting and uncalled for remarks." Here the unfeeling Toad broke into a snigger, and then pulled himself together and tried to look particularly solemn. Wow, he is kind of a jerk. "And the wild wooders have been living in Toad Hall ever since," continued the rat, "and going on simply anyhow, lying in bed half the day and breakfast at all hours, and the place in such a mess, I'm told, it's not fit to be seen. Eating your grub and drinking your drink and making bad jokes about you, and singing vulgar songs about, well, about prisons and magistrates and policemen, horrid personal songs with no humour in them. And they're telling the tradespeople and everybody that they've come to stay for good." "Oh, have they?" said Toad, getting up and seizing a stick. "I'll jolly soon see about that." "It's no good, Toad," called the rat after him. "You'd better come back and sit down. You'll only get into trouble." But the toad was off, and there was no holding him. He marched rapidly down the road, his stick over his shoulder, fuming and muttering to himself in his anger, till he got near his front gate, when suddenly there popped up from behind the palings a long yellow ferret with a gun. "Who goes there?" said the ferret sharply. "Stuff and nonsense!" said Toad very angrily. "What do you mean by talking like that to me? Come out of that at once, or I'll—" The ferret said never a word, but he brought his gun up to his shoulder. Toad prudently dropped flat in the road, and bang! A bullet whistled over his head. The startled Toad scrambled to his feet and scampered off down the road as hard as he could, and as he ran he heard the ferret laughing and utter horrid thin little laughs, taking it up and carrying on the sound. He went back very crestfallen and told the water rat. "What did I tell you?" said the rat. "It's no good. They've got sentries posted and they're all armed. You must just wait." Still Toad was not inclined to give in all at once, so he got out the boat and set off rowing up the river to where the garden front of Toad Hall came down to the waterside. Arriving within sight of his old home, he rested on his oars and surveyed the land cautiously. All seemed very peaceful and deserted and quiet. He could see the whole front of Toad Hall glowing in the evening sunshine, the pigeons settling by twos and threes along the straight line of the roof, the garden a blaze of flowers, the creek that led up to the boathouse, the I'm getting a little tongue-tied there, the little wooden bridge that crossed it, all tranquil, uninhabited, apparently waiting for his return. He would try the boathouse first, he thought. Very warily he paddled up to the mouth of the creek, and was just passing under the bridge when— crash! A great stone dropped from above, smashed through the bottom of the boat. It filled and sank, and Toad found himself struggling in deep water. Looking up, he saw two stouts leaning over the parapet of the bridge, and watching him with great glee. "It'll be your head next time, Toady!" they called out to him. The indignant Toad swam to shore while the stouts laughed and laughed, supporting each other, and laughed again, till they nearly had two fits. That is, one fit each, of course. The Toad retraced his weary way on foot, and related his disappointing experiences to the water rat once more. "Oh, hello there, Jewelry Jelly. Welcome. Thank you for the raid." What? What? Objection? What? What? Am I on trial? What? Uh, um, well, well, look, look, all I did was get a little bit obsessed with a few books. Nothing too grave. I mean, I'm already in my exile. What else? Oh, you're making jokes. Hello there, Time Sage. Welcome. How did your stream go? Was it a lot of fun? What have you been streaming lately? Can I do a shout out? Wonder if I can do a shout out. Never done shout outs before, so we'll see if this works. Nope. Doesn't work. I don't know how to do that. Oh dear. I'll figure that out. Joey Jelly, yes, there were lawyers racing. Well, that's interesting. That sounds like an interesting game. Joey Jelly, I think there's a Twitch function now. I'm not sure what the Twitch function is, though. I'll have to take a look into it later. Because I wanted to shout out you so badly. Okay, we are on the second to last chapter of Wind in the Willows. And they are trying to get back Toad Hall from the Wild Wooders. The Wild Wooders. Try and say that 10 times fast. Wild Wooders, Wild Wooders, yeah, something like that. And related his disappointing experiences to the water rat once more. What did I tell you? Said the rat very crossly. And now look here. See what you've been and done. Lost me my boat that I was so fond of. That's what you've done. And simply ruined that nice suit of clothes that I lent you. Really, Toad, of all the trying animals, I wonder you managed to keep any friends at all. The Toad saw at once how wrongly and foolishly he had acted. He admitted his errors and wrong-headedness, and made a full apology to Rat for losing his boat and spoiling his clothes. And he wound up by saying, with that frank self-surrender which always disarmed his friends' criticisms, and won them back to his side, "Ratty, I see that I have been a headstrong and a wilful Toad. Henceforth, believe me, I will be humble and submissive, and will take no action without your kind advice and full approval." "If that is really so," said the good-natured rat, already appeased, "then my advice to you is, considering the lateness of the hour, to sit down and have your supper, which will be on the table in a minute. Be very patient, for I am convinced that we can do nothing till we have seen the mole and the badger and heard their latest news, and held conference and taken their advice on this difficult matter." "Oh, yes, of course, the mole and the badger," said Toad lightly. "What's become of them, the dear fellows? I had forgotten all about them." Well may you ask," said the rat reproachfully. "While you were riding about the country in expensive motor cars, and galloping proudly on blood horses, and breakfasting on the fat of the land, those two poor devoted animals have been camping out in the open, in every sort of weather, living very rough by day and lying very hard by night, watching over your house, patrolling your boundaries, keeping a constant eye on the stoats and the weasels, scheming and planning and contriving how to get your property back for you. You don't deserve to have such true and loyal friends, Toad, you don't, really. Some day when it's too late, you'll be sorry you didn't value them more when you had them." "I'm an ungrateful beast, I know," sobbed Toad, shedding bitter tears. "Let me go out and find them, out in the cold, dark night, and share their hardships, and try and prove by— Hold on a bit. Surely I heard the chink of dishes on a tray. Someone here's at last! Hooray! Come on, Ratty!" The rat remembered that poor Toad had been on prison fare for a considerable time, and that large allowances had therefore to be made. He followed him to the table accordingly, and hospitably encouraged him in his gallant efforts to make up for past privations. Private Maverick, I have to head off. Thanks for the story. Oh, you're very welcome, Private Maverick. Thank you for coming. It's always wonderful to see you here. They had just finished their meal and resumed their armchairs when there came a heavy knock at the door. Toad was nervous, but the rat, nodding mysteriously at him, went straight up to the door and opened it, and in walked Mr. Badger. He had all the appearances of one who had for some nights had been kept away from home and all its little comforts and conveniences. His shoes were covered with mud, and he was looking very rough and tousled. But then he had never been a very smart man, the Badger, at the best of times. He came solemnly up to Toad, shook him by the paw, and said, "Welcome home, Toad. Alas, what am I saying? Home indeed. This is a poor homecoming, unhappy Toad." Then he turned his back on him, sat down to the table, drew his chair up, and helped himself to a large slice of cold pie. Toad was quite alarmed by this very serious and portentous style of greeting, but the rat whispered to him, "Never mind, don't take any notice, and don't say anything to him just yet. He's always rather low and despondent when he's wanting his victuals. In half an hour's time he'll be quite a different animal." And so they waited in silence, and presently there came another and a lighter knock. The rat, with a nod to Toad, went to the door, and ushered in the mole, very shabby and unwashed, with bits of hay and straw sticking in his fur.
"Hooray! Here's old Toad!"
cried the mole, his face beaming.
"Fancy having you back again!"
and began to dance around him.
"We never dreamt you would turn up so soon. Why, you must have managed to escape, you clever, ingenious, intelligent Toad!"
The rat, alarmed, pulled him by the elbow, but it was too late. Toad was puffing and swelling already.
"Clever? Oh, no!" he said. "I'm not really clever, according to my friends. I've only broken out of the strongest prison in England, that's all, and captured a railway train, and escaped on it, that's all, and disguised myself and gone about the country humbugging everybody, that's all. Oh, no! I'm a stupid ass, I am. I'll tell you one or two of my little adventures, Mole, and you shall judge for yourself."
So many voices to do.
"Well, well," said the mole, moving towards the supper table. "Supposing you talk while I eat. Not a bite since breakfast. Oh my, oh my!"
And he sat down and helped himself liberally to cold beef and pickles. That sounds wonderful right now. That's the problem with reading these books when they mention food. The food sounds absolutely wonderful all the time. Toad straddled on the hearth rug, thrust his paws into his trouser pocket, and pulled out a handful of silver.
"Look at that!" he cried, displaying it. "That's not so bad, is it, for a few minutes' work? And how do you think I done it, Mole? Horse stealing, that's how I done it." "Go on, Toad," said Mole, immensely interested.
"Toad, do be quiet, please," said the rat, "and don't you egg him on, Mole, when you know what he is. But please tell us as soon as possible what the position is, and what's best to be done, now that Toad's back at last."
"The position's about as bad as it can be,"
replied the mole grumpily.
"And as for what's to be done, why, blessed if I know. The badger and I have been round and round the place by night and by day. Always the same thing. Sentries posted everywhere, guns poked out at us, stones thrown at us, always an animal on the lookout, and when they see us, my, how they do laugh. That's what annoys me most."
"It's a very difficult situation," said the rat, reflecting deeply. "But I think I see now, in the depths of my mind, what Toad really ought to do. I will tell you. He ought to—"
"No, he oughtn't," shouted the mole, with his mouth full. "Nothing of the sort. You don't understand. What he ought to do is— what he ought to do—" "Well, I shan't do it anyway," cried Toad, getting excited. "I'm not going to be ordered about by you fellows. It's my house we're talking about, and I know exactly what to do. And I'll tell you, I'm going to—"
By this time, they were all three talking at once, at the top of their voices, and the noise was simply deafening, when a thin, dry voice made itself heard, saying, "Be quiet at once, all of you." And instantly everyone was silent. It was the badger, who, having finished his pie, had turned round in his chair, and was looking at them severely. When he saw that he had secured their attention, and that they were evidently waiting for him to address them, he turned back to the table again and reached out for the cheese. And so great was the respect commanded by the solid qualities of that admirable animal, that not another word was uttered until he had quite finished his repast and brushed the crumbs from his knees. The Toad fidgeted a good deal, but the rat held him firmly down. When the badger had quite done, he got up from his seat and stood before the fireplace, reflecting deeply. At last he spoke. "Toad," he said severely. "You bad, troublesome little animal. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? What do you think your father, my old friend, would have said if he had been here tonight and had known of all your goings-on?" Toad, who was on the sofa by this time, with his legs up, rolled over on his face, shaken by sobs of contrition. Contrition. I hope that's the word. "There, there," went on the Badger more kindly. "Never mind, stop crying. We're going to let bygones be bygones and try and turn over a new leaf. But what the mole says is quite true. The stouts are on guard at every point, and they make the best sentinels in the world. It is quite useless to think of attacking the place. They are too strong for us." "Then it's all over," sobbed the Toad, crying to the sofa cushions. "I shall go and enlist for a soldier, and never see my dear Toad Hall any more." "Come, cheer up, Toady," said the Badger. "There are more ways of getting back a place than taking it by storm. I haven't said my last word yet. Now I'm going to tell you a great secret." Excuse me. Toad sat up slowly and dried his eyes. Secrets had an immense attraction for him, because he could never keep one. Because he never could keep one, and he enjoyed the sort of unhallowed thrill he experienced when he went and told another animal, after having faithfully promised not to. What is with Toad? So troublesome. "There is an underground passage," said the Badger, impressively, "that leads from the river bank quite near here, right up into the middle of Toad Hall." "Oh, nonsense, Badger!" said Toad rather airily. "You've been listening to some of the yarns they spin in the public houses about here. I know every inch of Toad Hall, inside and out. Nothing of the sort, I do assure you." "My young friend," said the Badger with great severity, "your father, who was a worthy animal, a lot worthier than some others I know, was a particular friend of mine, and told me a great deal he wouldn't have dreamt of telling you. He discovered that passage. He didn't make it, of course. That was done hundreds of years before he ever came to live here, and he repaired it and cleaned it out, because he thought it might come in useful some day in case of trouble or danger, and he showed it to me. 'Don't let my son know about it,' he said. 'He's a good boy, but very light and volatile in character, and simply cannot hold his tongue. If he's ever in a real fix, and it would be of use to him, you may tell him about the secret passage, but not before.'" The other animals looked hard at Toad to see how he would take it. Toad was inclined to be sulky at first, but he brightened up immediately, like the good fellow he was. "Well, well," he said, "perhaps I am a bit of a talker. A popular fellow such as I am. My friends get round me. We chaff, we sparkle, we tell witty stories. And somehow my tongue gets wagging. I have the gift of conversation. I've been told I ought to have a salon, whatever that may be. Never mind. Go on, Badger. How's this passage of yours going to help us?"
"I've found out a thing or two lately," continued the Badger. "I got Otter to disguise himself as a sweep and call at the back door with brushes over his shoulder, asking for a job. There's going to be a big banquet tomorrow night. It's somebody's birthday, the Chief Weasel's, I believe, and all the weasels will be gathered together in the dining hall, eating and drinking and laughing and carrying on, suspecting nothing. No guns, no swords, no sticks, no arms of any sort whatever."
"But the sentinels will be posted as usual," remarked the Rat.
"Exactly, said the Badger. "That is my point. The weasels will trust entirely to their excellent sentinels. and that is where the passage comes in. That very useful tunnel leads right up under the butler's pantry, next to the dining hall.
Ah! That squeaky board in the butler's pantry, said Toad. Now I understand it. We shall creep out quietly into the butler's pantry, cried the Mole. With our pistols and swords and sticks, shouted the Rat.
And rush in upon them,
said the Badger. And whack 'em, and whack 'em, and whack 'em, cried the Toad in ecstasy, running round and round the room and jumping over the chairs.
Very well then,
said the Badger, resuming his usual dry manner.
Our plan is settled, and there's nothing more for you to argue or squabble about. So as it's getting very late, all of you go right off to bed at once. We will make all the necessary arrangements in the course of the mornings tomorrow.
Toad, of course, went off to bed dutifully with the rest. He knew better than to refuse, though he was feeling much too excited to sleep. But he had had a long day, with many events crowded into it. And sheets and blankets were very friendly and comforting things. After plain straw and not too much of it, spread on the stone floor of a draughty cell, and his head had not been many seconds on his pillow before he was snoring happily. Naturally, he dreamt a good deal about roads that ran away from him just as he wanted them, and canals that chased him and caught him, and a barge that sailed into the banqueting hall with his week's washing, just as he was giving a dinner party, and he was alone in the secret passage, pushing onwards, but it twisted and turned round and shook itself, and sat up on end. Yet somehow, at last, he found himself back in Toad Hall, safe in triumph, with all his friends gathered round about him, earnestly assuring him that he really was a clever toad. He slept till a late hour next morning, and by the time he got down he found that the other animals had finished their breakfast some time before. The Toad had slipped off somewhere by himself, without telling anyone where he was going to. The Badger sat in the armchair reading the paper and not concerning himself in the slightest about what was going to happen that very evening. The Rat, on the other hand, was running round the room busily, with his arms full of weapons of every kind, distributing them in 4 little heaps on the floor, saying excitedly under his breath as he ran, "Here's a sword for the Rat, here's a sword for the Mole, here's a sword for the Toad, here's a sword for the Badger, here's a pistol for the Rat, here's a pistol for the Mole, here's a pistol for the Toad, here's a pistol for the Badger," and so on, in a regular rhythmical way, while the 4 little heaps gradually grew and grew.
"That's all very well, Rat," said the Badger presently, looking at the busy little animal over the edge of his newspaper. "I'm not blaming you, but just let us once get past the Stouts with those detestable guns of theirs, and I assure you we shan't want any swords or pistols. We 4 with our sticks, once we're inside the dining hall, why, we shall clear the floor of all the lot of them in 5 minutes. I'd have done the whole thing by myself, only I didn't want to deprive you fellows of the fun."
It's as well to be on the safe side," said the Rat reflectively, polishing a pistol barrel on his sleeve and looking along it. The Toad, having finished his breakfast, picked up a stout stick and swung it vigorously, belabouring imaginary animals. I'll learn him to steal my house," he cried. I'll learn him." "Don't say learn him, Toad," said the Rat, greatly shocked. "It's not good English."
"What are you always nagging at Toad for?" inquired the Badger, rather peevishly. "What's the matter with his English? It's the same what I use myself, and if it's good enough for me, it ought to be good enough for you."
"I'm very sorry," said the Rat humbly. "Only I think it ought to be teach him, not learn him."
"But we don't want to teach him," replied the Badger. "We want to learn him. Learn him, and what's more, we're going to do it too."
Presently oh, very well, have it your own way, said the rat. He was getting rather muddled about it himself, and presently he retired into a corner where he could be heard muttering, "Learn him, teach him, learn him," till the badger told him rather sharply to leave off. Presently the mole came tumbling into the room, evidently very pleased with himself. "I've been having such fun," he began at once. "I've been getting a rise out of the stouts." "I hope you've been very careful, Mole," said the rat anxiously.
"I should hope so too," said the mole confidently. "I got the idea when I went into the kitchen to see about Toad's breakfast being kept hot for him. I found that old washerwoman dress that he came home in yesterday hanging on a towel horse before the fire. So I put it on, and the bonnet as well, and the shawl, and off I went to Toad Hall, as bold as you please. The sentries were on the lookout, of course, with their guns and their 'Who comes there?' and all the rest of their nonsense. 'Good morning, gentlemen,' says I, very respectful. 'Want any washing done today?' They looked at me very proud and stiff and haughty, and said, 'Go away, washerwoman. We don't do any washing on duty.' 'Or any other time,' says I. Ho, ho, ho! Wasn't I funny, Toad?"
"Poor frivolous animal," said Toad very loftily. The fact is, he felt exceedingly jealous of Mole for what he had just done. It was exactly what he would have liked to have done himself, if only he had thought of it first, and hadn't gone and overslept himself.
"Some of the stouts turned quite pink," continued the mole, "and the sergeant in charge, he said to me very short, he said, 'Now run away, my good woman, run away. Don't keep my men idling and talking on their posts.' 'Run away,' says I. 'It won't be me they'll be running away in a very short time from now.'"
"Oh, Moley, how could you?" said the rat, dismayed. The badger laid down his paper.
"I could see them pricking up their ears and looking at each other," went on the mole, "and the sergeant said to them, 'Never mind her, she doesn't know what she's talking about.'" "Oh, don't I?" says I. "Well, let me tell you this. My daughter, she washes for Mr. Badger, and that'll show you whether I know what I'm talking about. And you'll know pretty soon, too. 100 bloodthirsty badgers armed with rifles are going to attack Toad Hall this very night, by way of the paddock. 6 boatloads of rats with pistols and cutlasses will come up the river and effect a landing in the garden, while a picked body of toads, known as the known as the diehards or the death or glory toads, will storm the orchard and carry everything before them, yelling for vengeance. There won't be much left of you to wash by the time they're done with you, unless you clear out while you have the chance.' Then I ran away, and when I was out of sight I hid. And presently I came creeping back along the ditch and took a peep at them through the hedge. They were all as nervous and flustered as could be, running all ways at once, and falling over each other, and every one giving orders to everybody else, and not listening, and the sergeant kept sending off parties of stouts to distant parts of the grounds, and then sending other fellows to fetch 'em back again, and I heard them saying to each other, 'That's just like the weasels. They're to stop comfortably in the banqueting hall and have feasting and toast and song and all sorts of fun, while we must stay on guard in the cold and dark, and in the end be cut to pieces by bloodthirsty badgers.'"
"Oh, you silly ass, Mole!" cried Toad. "You've been and spoilt everything." "Mole," said the badger in his dry, quiet way, "I perceive you have more sense in your little finger than some other animals have in the whole of their fat bodies. You manage excellently, and I begin to have great hopes of you. Good Mole, clever Mole." The toad was simply wild with jealousy, more especially as he couldn't make out for the life of him what the mole had done that was so particularly clever. But fortunately for him, before he could show temper or expose himself to the badger's sarcasm, the bell rang for luncheon. It was a simple but sustaining meal: bacon and broad beans, and a macaroni pudding. And when they had quite done, the badger settled himself into an armchair and said, "Well, we've got our work cut out for us tonight, and it will probably be pretty late before we're quite through with it. So I'm going to take 40 winks while I can." And he drew a handkerchief over his face and was soon snoring. The anxious and laborious rat at once resumed his preparations, and started running between his four little heaps, muttering, "Here's a belt for the rat, here's a belt for the mole, here's a belt for the toad, here's a belt for the badger," and so on, with every fresh accoutrement he produced, to which there seemed really no end. So the mole drew his arm through Toad's, led him out into the open air, shoved him into a wicker chair, and made him tell him all his adventures from beginning to end, which Toad was only too willing to do. The mole was a good listener, and Toad, with no one to check his statements or to criticize in an unfriendly spirit, rather let himself go. Indeed, much that he related belonged more properly to the category of what might have happened had I only thought of it in time, instead of 10 minutes afterwards. Those are always the best and the raciest adventures, and why should they not be truly ours, as much as the somewhat inadequate things that really come off? Another drink. Oh my goodness, all these voices. I'll have to rest my voice for it. And here we go, my dear scholars. Chapter 12: The Return of Ulysses. When it began to grow dark, the rat, with an air of excitement and mystery, summoned them back into the parlor, stood each of them up alongside of his little heap, and proceeded to dress them up for the coming expedition. He was very earnest and thorough-going about it. The affair took quite a long time. First there was a belt to go round each animal, and then a sword to be stuck into each belt, and then a cutlass on the other side to balance it. Then a pair of pistols, a policeman's truncheon, several sets of handcuffs, some bandages and sticking plaster, and a flask and a sandwich case. The badger laughed good-humoredly and said, "All right, Ratty, it amuses you, and it doesn't hurt me. I'm going to do all I've got to do with this here stick." But the rat only said, "Please, Badger, you know I shouldn't like you to blame me afterwards, and say I had forgotten anything." When all was quite ready, and the badger took a dark lantern in one paw, grasped his great stick with the other, and said, "Now then, follow me. Mole first, 'cause I'm very pleased with him. Rat next, Toad last. And look here, Toady, don't you chatter so much as usual, or you'll be sent back, as sure as fate." The toad was so anxious not to be left out that he took up the inferior position assigned to him without a murmur, and the animals set off. The badger led them along by the river for a little way, and then suddenly swung himself over the edge into a hole in the river bank, a little above the water. The mole and the rat followed silently, swinging themselves successfully into the hole as they had seen the badger do. But when it came to Toad's turn, of course he managed to slip and fall into the water with a loud splash and a squeal of alarm. He was hauled out by his friends, rubbed down and run out hastily, comforted and set on his legs. But the badger was seriously angry, and told him that the very next time he made a fool of himself, he would most certainly be left behind. So at last they began. So at last they were in the secret passage, and the cutting out expedition had really begun. It was cold and dark and damp, and low and narrow and poor Toad began to shiver, partially from dread of what might be before him, partially because he was wet through. The lantern was far ahead, and he could not help lagging behind a little in the darkness. Then he heard the rat call out warningly, "Come on, Toad!" And a terror seized him of being left behind, alone in the darkness, and he came on with such a rush that he upset the rat into the mole, and the mole into the badger, and for a moment all was confusion. The badger thought they were being attacked from behind, and as there was no room to use a stick or a cutlass, drew a pistol and was on the point of putting a bullet into Toad. When he found out what had really happened, he was very angry indeed, and said, "Now this time that tiresome Toad shall be left behind." But Toad whimpered, and the other two promised that they would be answerable for his good conduct, and at last the badger was pacified, and the procession moved on, only this time the rat brought up the rear, with a firm grip on the shoulder of Toad. So they groped and shuffled along, with their ears pricked up and their paws on their pistols, till at last the badger said, "We ought by now to be pretty nearly under the hole." Then suddenly they heard, far away as they might be, and yet apparently nearly over their heads, a confused murmur of sound, as if people were shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor and hammering on tables. The Toad's nervous terrors all returned, but the badger only remarked placidly, "They are going it, the weasels." The passage now began to slope upwards. They groped onward a little further, and then the noise broke out again, quite distinct this time, and very close above them. "Ooré, ooré, 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 ooré," they heard, and the stamping of little feet on the floor, and the clinking of glasses as little fists pounded on the table. "What a time they're having," said the badger. "Come on." They hurried along the passage till it came to a full stop, and they found themselves standing under the trap door that led up into the butler's pantry. Such a tremendous noise was going on in the banqueting hall that there was little danger of their being overheard. The badger said, "Now, boys, all together." The four of them put their shoulders to the trap door and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry, with only a door between them and the banqueting hall, where their unconscious enemies were carousing. The noise as they emerged from the passage was simply deafening. At last, as the cheering and hammering slowly subsided, a voice could be made out saying,
"Well, I do not propose to detain you much longer."
Great applause.
"But before I resume my seat,"
Resumed renewed cheering.
"I should like to say one word about our kind host, Mr. Toad. We all know Toad."
Great laughter.
"Good Toad, modest Toad, honest Toad."
Shrieks of merriment.
"Oh, just let me get at him,"
muttered Toad, grinding his teeth.
"Hold hard a minute,"
said the badger, restraining him with difficulty.
"Get ready, all of you."
"Let me sing you a little song," went on the voice, "which I have composed on the subject of Toad."
Prolonged a pause. Then the chief weasel, for it was he, began in a high, squeaky voice. And here we go with another song, my dear scholars.
Toady went a pleasuring gaily down the street.
The badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick with both paws, glanced round at his comrades, and cried,
The hour is come. Follow me,"
and flung the door open wide. My, what a squealing and a squeaking and a screeching filled the air! Well might the terrified weasels dive under the tables and spring madly up the windows, Well might the ferrets rush wildly for the fireplace and get hopelessly jammed in the chimney. Well might tables and chairs be upset and glass and china be sent crashing on the floor, in the panic of that terrible moment when the four heroes strode wrathfully into the room. The mighty badger, his whiskers bristling, his great cudgel whistling through the air. Mole black and grim, brandishing his stick and shouting his awful war cry, "A mole! A mole!" That's a war cry? No, dear Molly. Rat, desperate and determined, his belt bulging with weapons of every age and every variety. Toad, frenzied with excitement and injured pride, swollen to twice his ordinary size, leaping into the air and emitting toad whoops that chilled them to the marrows. "Toady went a pleasuring," he yelled. "I'll pleasure them." And he went straight for the Chief Weasel. They were but four in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels, the hall seemed full of monstrous animals, gray, black, brown, and yellow, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels, and they broke and fled with squeals of terror and dismay, this way and that, through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of the reach of those terrible sticks. The affair was soon over. Up and down the whole length of the hall strode the four friends, whacking with their sticks at every head that showed itself, and in 5 minutes the room was cleared. Through the broken windows the shrieks of terrified weasels escaping across the lawn was borne faintly to their ears. On the floor lay prostrate some dozen or so of the enemy, on whom the mole was busily engaged in fitting handcuffs. The badger, resting from his labors, leant on his stick, and wiped his honest brow. "Mole," he said, "you're the best of fellows. Just cut a lawn outside and look after those stout sentries of yours, and see what they're doing. I've an idea that, thanks to you, we shan't have much trouble from them tonight." The mole vanished promptly through a window, and the badger bade the other two set a table on its legs again, pick up knives and forks and plates and glasses from the debris on the floor, and see if they could find materials for supper. "I want some grub, I do," he said in that rather common way he had of speaking. "Stir your stumps, Toad, and look lively. We've got your house back for you, and you don't offer us so much as a sandwich." Toad felt rather hurt that the badger didn't say pleasant things to him, as he had to the mole, and tell him what a fine fellow he was, and how splendidly he had fought, for he was rather particularly pleased with himself in the way he had gone for the Chief Weasel, and sent him flying across the table with one blow of his stick. But he bustled about, and so did the rat, and soon they found some guava jelly in a glass dish, and a cold chicken, a tongue that had hardly been touched, some trifle, and quite a lot of lobster salad. And in the pantry they came upon a basket full of French rolls, and any quantity of cheese, butter, and celery. They were just about to sit down when the mole clambered in through the window, chuckling with an armful of trifles. "It's all over," he reported. "From what I can make out, as soon as the stouts, who were very nervous and jumpy already, heard the shrieks and the yells, and the uproar inside the hall, some of them threw down their rifles and fled. The others stood fast for a bit, but when the weasels came rushing out upon them, they thought they were betrayed, and the stouts grappled with the weasels, and the weasels fought to get away, and they wrestled and wriggled and punched each other and rolled over and over, till most of them rolled into the river. They've all disappeared by now, one way or another, and I've got their rifles, so that's all right."
"Excellent and deserving animal," said the badger, his mouth full of chicken and trifle. There's just one more thing I want you to do. Mole, before you sit down to your supper, lot of us, and I wouldn't trouble you, only I know I can trust you to see a thing done, and I wish I could say the same of everyone I know. I'd send Rat if he wasn't a poet. I want you to take those fellows on the floor there upstairs with you, and have some bedrooms cleaned out and tidied up and made really comfortable. See that they sweep under the beds and put clean sheets and pillowcases on and turn down one corner of the bedcloths, just as you know it ought to be done, and have a can of hot water and clean towels and a fresh cake of soap put in every room, and then you can give them a licking apiece, if it's any satisfaction to you, and put them out by the back door. And we shan't see any more of them, I fancy. And then come along and have some of this cold tongue. It's first rate. I'm very pleased with you, Mole.
The good-natured mole picked up a stick, formed his prisoners up in a line on the floor, gave them the order, "Quick, march!" and led his squad up to the upper rooms. After a time he appeared again, smiling, and said that every room was ready, as clean as a new pin. "And I didn't have to lick them either," he added. "I thought on the whole that they had had a licking enough for one night, and the weasels, when I put the point to them, quite agreed with me, and said they wouldn't think of troubling me. They were very penitent, and said they were extremely sorry for what they had done, but it was all the fault of the chief weasel and the stouts, and if ever they could do anything for us at any time to make up, we had only got to mention it. So I gave them a roll apiece and let them out at the back, and off they ran as hard as they could." Oh, Molly is so kind. And then the mole pulled his chair up to the table, and pitched into the cold tun, and Toad, like the gentleman he was, put all his jealousy from him, and said heartily, "Thank you kindly, dear Mole, for all your pains and trouble tonight, and especially for your cleverness this morning." The Badger was pleased at this, and said, "There spoke my brave Toad." So they finished their supper in great joy and contentment, and presently retired to rest between clean sheets, safe in Toad's ancestral hall, won back by matchless valor, consummate strategy, and a proper handling of sticks. Whew. The following morning Toad, who had overslept himself as usual, came down to breakfast, disgracefully late, and found on the table a certain quantity of eggshells, some fragments of toad and cold and leathery toast, a coffee pot 3/4 empty, and really very little else, which did not tend to improve his temper, considering that, after all, it was his own house. Through the French windows of the breakfast room he could see the mole and the water rat sitting in wicker chairs out on the lawn, evidently telling each other stories, roaring with laughter, and kicking their short legs in the air. The Badger, who was in an armchair and deep in the morning paper, merely looked up and nodded when Toad entered the room. But Toad knew his man, so he sat down and made the best breakfast he could, merely observing to himself that he would get square with the others sooner or later. When he had nearly finished, the Badger looked up and remarked rather shortly, "I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. You see, we really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you. In fact, it's the rule."
Oh, all right," said the Toad readily. "Anything to oblige. Although, why on earth you should want to have a banquet in the morning, I cannot understand. But you know I do not live to please myself, but merely to find out what my friends want, and then try and arrange it for 'em. You dear old Badger."
"Don't pretend to be stupider than you really are," replied the Badger crossly. "And don't chuckle and splutter in your coffee while you're talking. It's not manners. What I mean is, the banquet will be at night, of course, but the invitations will have to be written and got off at once, and you've got to write them. Now sit down at the table. There's stacks of letter paper on it, with Toad Hall at the top in blue and gold, and write invitations to all your friends. And if you stick to it, we shall get them out before luncheon, and I'll bear a hand too, and take my share of the burden. I'll order the banquet.
What? Said Toad, dismayed. Me? Stop indoors and write a lot of rotten letters on a jolly morning like this, when I want to go round my property and set everything and everybody to rights, and swagger about and enjoy myself? Certainly not. I'll see you. Stop a minute, though. Why, of course, dear Badger. What is my pleasure or convenience compared with that of others? You wish it done, and it shall be done. Go, Badger, order the banquet. Order what you like. Then join our young friends outside in their innocent mirth, oblivious of me and my cares and toils. I sacrifice this fair morning on the altar of duty and friendship. The Badger looked at him very suspiciously, but Toad's frank, open countenance made it difficult to suggest any unworthy motive in this change of attitude. He quitted the room accordingly in the direction of the kitchen, and as soon as the doors had closed behind him, Toad hurried to the writing table. A fine idea had occurred to him while he was talking. He would write the invitations, and he would take care to mention the leading part he had taken in the fight, and how he had laid the Chief Weasel flat. And he would hint at his adventures, and what a career of triumph he had to tell about. And on the flyleaf he would set out a sort of program of entertainment for the evening. Something like this, as he sketched it out in his head. Ahem. A speech by Toad. There will be other speeches by Toad during the evening. Address by Toad. Synopsis: Our prison system, the waterways of Old England, horse dealing, and how to deal. Property, its rights and its duties. Back to the land, a typical English squire. Song by Toad, composed by himself. Other compositions by Toad will be sung in the course of the evening by the composer. The idea pleased him mightily, and he worked very hard and got all the letters finished by noon, at which hour it was reported to him that there was a small and rather bedraggled weasel at the door, inquired timidly whether he could be of any service to the gentleman. Toad swaggered out and found it was one of the prisoners of the previous evening, very respectful and anxious to please. He patted him on the head, shoved the bundle of invitations into his paw, and told him to cut along quick and deliver them as fast as he could, and if he liked to come back again in the evening, perhaps there might be a shilling for him, or again perhaps there mightn't, and the poor weasel seemed really quite grateful, and hurried off eagerly to do his mission. When the other animals came back to luncheon, very boisterous and breezy after a morning on the river, the mole, whose conscience had been pricking him, looked doubtfully at Toad, expecting to find him sulky or depressed. Instead, he was so uppish and inflated that the mole began to suspect something, while the rat and Badger exchanged significant glances. As soon as the meal was over, Toad thrust his paws deep into his trouser pockets, remarked casually, "Well, look after yourselves, you fellows. Ask for anything you want," and was swaggering off in the direction of the garden, where he wanted to think out an idea or two for his coming speeches, when the rat caught him by the arm. Toad rather suspected what he was after, and did his best to get away, but when the Badger took him firmly by the other arm, he began to see that the game was up. The two animals conducted him between them into the small smoking room that opened out of the entrance hall, shut the door, and put him into a chair. Then they both stood in front of him, while the Toad sat silent and regarded them with much suspicious and ill humor. "Now, look here, Toad," said the rat. "It's about this banquet, and very sorry I am to have to speak to you like this, but we want you to understand clearly, once and for all, that there are going to be no speeches and no songs. Try and grasp the fact that on this occasion we're not arguing with you. We're just telling you." Toad saw that he was trapped. They understood him. They saw through him. They had got a hold ahead of him. His pleasant dream was shattered. Mayn't I sing them just one little song? He pleaded piteously. No, not one little song, replied the rat firmly, though his heart bled as he noticed the trembling lip of the poor disappointed toad. It's no good, Toady. You know well that your songs are all conceit and boasting and vanity. Your speeches are all self-praise and gross exaggeration and gas, put in the badger in his common way. It's for your own good, Toady, went on the rat. You know you must turn over a new leaf sooner or later, and now seems a splendid time to begin, a sort of turning point in your career. Please don't think that saying all this doesn't hurt me more than it hurts you. Toad remained a long while plunged in thought. At last he raised his head, and the traces of strong emotion were visible on his features. You have conquered, my friends, he said in broken accents. It was, to be sure, but a small thing that I asked. Merely leave to blossom and expand for yet one more evening, to let myself go and hear the tumultuous applause that always seems to me somehow to bring out my best qualities. However, you are right, I know, and I am wrong. Henceforth I will be a very different Toad, my friends. You shall never have occasion to blush for me again. But oh dear, this is a hard world. And pressing his handkerchief to his face, he left the room with faltering footsteps. Badger, said the rat, I feel like a brute. I wonder what you feel like. Oh, I know, said the badger gloomily, but the thing had to be done. This good fellow has got to live here, and hold his own and be respected. Will you have him a common laughing-stock, mocked and jeered at by stoats and weasels? Of course not, said the rat, and talking of weasels, it's lucky we came upon that little weasel, just as he was setting out with Toad's invitations. I suspected something from what you told me, and had a look at one or two. They were simply disgraceful. Confiscated the lot, and the good mole is now sitting the blue boudoir, filling up plain, simple invitation cards. Another drink. At last the hour for the banquet began to draw near, and Toad, who on leaving the others had retired to his bedroom, was sitting there melancholy and thoughtful. His brow resting on his paw, he pondered long and deeply. Gradually his countenance cleared, and he began to smile long, slow smiles. Then he took to giggling in a shy, self-conscious manner. At last he got up, locked the door, drew the curtains across the windows, collected all the chairs in the room and arranged them in a semicircle, took up his position in front of them, swelling visibly. Then he bowed, coughed twice, and letting himself go with uplifted voice, he sang to the enraptured audience that his imagination so clearly saw. And here we go, my dear scholars, the last song in the book. Let's see if I can do something with this. It's called Toad's Last Little Song. The Toad came home. There was panic in the parlors and howling in the halls. There were crying in the cowsheds and shrieking in the stalls. When the Toad came home, when the Toad came home. There was smashing in of the windows and crashing in of door. There was chirring of weasels that fainted on the floor when the Toad came home. Bang go the drums, the trumpeters are tooting, and the soldiers are saluting, and the cannon they are shooting, and the motor cars are tooting, as the hero comes. Shout hooray, and let each one of the crowd try, and shout it very loud, in honor of an animal of whom you're justly proud, for it's Toad's great day. He sang this very loud, with great unsulation, and expression. And when he had done, he sang it all over again. Then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh. Then he dipped his hairbrush in the water jug, parted his hair in the middle, and plastered it down very straight and sleek on each side of his face, and unlocking the door went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests, who he knew must be assembling in the drawing room. All the animals cheered when he entered, and crowded round to congratulate him, and say nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting qualities. But Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Not at all," or sometimes for a change, "On the contrary." Otter, who was standing on the hearthrug, describing to an admiring circle of friends exactly how he would have managed things had he been there, came forward with a shout, threw his arms round Toad's neck, and tried to take him round the room in triumphal progress. But Toad, in a mild way, was rather snubby to him, remarking gently as he disengaged himself, "Badger's was the mastermind. The mole and the water rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks and did little or nothing." The animals were evidently puzzled and taken aback by this unexpected attitude of his, and Toad felt as he moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, that he was an object of absorbing interest to every one. The Badger had ordered everything of the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking and laughter and chaff among the animals, but through it all Toad, who of course was in the chair, looked down his nose and murmured pleasant nothings to the animals on either side of him. At intervals he stole a glance at the Badger and the Rat, and always when he looked they were staring at each other with their mouths open, and this gave him the greatest satisfaction. Some of the younger and livelier animals, as the evening wore on, got whispering to each other that things were not so amusing as they used to be in the good old days, and there were some knockings on the table and cries of, "Toad, speech! Speech from Toad! Son! Mr. Toad's son!" But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw in mild protest, and by pressing delicacies on his guests, by topical small talk, and by earnest inquiries after members of their families not yet old enough to appear at social functions, managed to convey to them that this dinner was being run on strictly conventional lines. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this climax, the four animals continued to lead their lives, so rudely broken in upon by civil war, in great joy and contentment, undisturbed by further risings or invasions. Toad, after due consultation with his friends, selected a handsome gold chain and locket set with pearls, which he dispatched to the gaoler's daughter with a letter that even the Badger admitted to be modest, grateful, and appreciative, and the engine driver in his turn was properly thanked and compensated for all his pains and trouble. Under severe compulsion from the Badger, even the barge woman was with some trouble sought out, and the value of her horse discreetly made good to her, though Toad kicked terribly at this, holding himself to be an instrument of fate sent to punish fat women with mottled arms who couldn't tell a real gentleman when they saw one. The amount involved, if it was true, was not very burdensome, the gypsy's valuation being admitted by local assessors to be approximately correct. Sometimes, in the course of long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wildwood, now successfully tamed so far as they were concerned, and it was pleasing to see how respectfully they were greeted by the inhabitants, and how the mother weasels would bring their young ones to the mouths of their holes and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and there's the gallant water rat, a terrible fighter, walking along with him. And yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole, of whom you so often have heard your father tell." But when their infants were factious and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling how, if they didn't hush them, and not fret them. The terrible gray badger would up and get them. This was a base libel on Badger, who, though he cared little about society, was rather fond of children, but it never failed to have its full effect. The end. Whew. And that was The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. That was an interesting and quite a nice ending. I will be moving over to the chat area now so we can close out our evening. And here we are. Julian20, thank you so much for reading this fine tale. I'm more than happy to. I really enjoyed it, and I'll miss Molly, Rat, and Badger. And Toad, of course, that fine, wonderful Toad. It was a lot of fun. It was interesting how the final battle was a little bit different than how it was originally, how it was portrayed in the Disney adaptation. Excuse me. Drank a lot of water there. Yes, it was action-packed, but a little bit quicker than the film version does. So yes, I'm a little bit worn out by that. That took a lot of energy from me. Even an omniversal librarian can get a little bit worn out by it. Firefly. We watched some of the Disney version last week. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. It's a good version with some changes, but it's a good version. So next week, before I forget, next week we will be doing a gaming stream on Tuesday. More Return to Monkey Island. And that'll be the only stream for that week. The following week, we'll be doing more gaming streaming, as you might expect, but we will also begin my annual reading of A Christmas Carol. I'm looking forward to that a great deal. One of my first streams as a VTuber was a reading of A Christmas Carol, and I'll be doing it again this year. I am hoping to turn it into an annual thing, and I'm hoping that you will all enjoy it. For now, I think we will close out for the evening. I see that Sophia Ignosi is streaming with, I believe it's the Marvelous Land of Oz, so I think it might be a good idea to visit her before we go. But until then, I say unto you, my dear scholars, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Till we meet again in the study. Take care now. Farewell, and I shall see you once more.